Imagine a world held together by a single material, bronze. A world where kingdoms rose and fell based on access to two metals that rarely occurred together, where ships crossed vast stretches of open sea carrying copper from one end of the known world and tin from the other. And only when they met in workshops could civilization continue, where palace bureaucrats tracked every jar of grain, every length of cloth, every bronze tool, writing it all down on clay tablets that would outlast the empires they served. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 1600 to 1200 BC, this system worked. Not perfectly, but reliably enough that people forgot it could ever stop working. The Eastern Mediterranean became a vast, interconnected network of trade and diplomacy. Pharaohs wrote to Hittite kings as brothers. Merchants knew routes as well as modern pilots know flight paths. Bronze flowed from workshop to field to battlefield and back again, melted down and reborn in an endless cycle. And then, in the span of a few generations, it all came apart. Tonight, we're going to trace the entire arc of the late Bronze Age world. We'll start in a time when the system seemed permanent and unshakable. We'll watch trade routes mature into highways across the sea. We'll see how palace economies coordinated thousands of people across hundreds of miles. We'll follow the signs of stress as the system began to strain. And we'll witness the collapse, not as a single catastrophe, but as a cascade of failures that transformed the ancient world. But before we begin our journey back to the Bronze Age, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to support this kind of content, and it genuinely makes a difference. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're listening tonight. Are you in Europe as the day ends? In Asia as morning approaches? Somewhere in the Americas in the deep hours of the night? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Get comfortable. Let the concerns of today fade into the background. We're traveling back more than 3,000 years, to a world that was once as real and solid as yours, to see how it worked and why it ended. If you could step into the Eastern Mediterranean around 2000 BC, 4,000 years before our time, you wouldn't find yourself at history's beginning. You'd arrive in a world already old, already shaped by countless generations who lived, farmed, built, and died on these same shores. The Nile Valley had known agriculture for millennia. Anatolia's plains bore the marks of settlement reaching back further than anyone then alive could trace. Along the Levantine coast, harbors sat where harbors had always been, their stones worn smooth by centuries of rope and timber. This wasn't a pristine world waiting to be discovered. It was lived in, worked over, divided up, and understood. The land had been measured, the fields allocated, the boundaries set and reset through inheritance and dispute. Memory here ran deep, pooling in the low places where villages clustered and flowing along trade routes that connected one familiar place to another. By approximately 1600 BC, let's pause there. 3,500 years before now, bronze had woven itself into the fabric of this world so completely that life without it would have been nearly unthinkable. Not that anyone thought about it much. Bronze was simply there. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. A farmer reaching for his sickle at first light didn't marvel at the metal in his hand. A soldier checking his spear before dawn didn't contemplate its composition. A priestess placing an offering vessel before a temple altar simply did what had been done before her, and would be done after. The metal was cold to touch, heavy in the palm, dense in a way that wood and stone could never match. It held an edge far longer than copper alone ever could. It bent under extreme stress rather than shattering outright. When it broke, and it did break, it could be melted down and reborn. Fragments had value. Even a broken fitting from a cart, corroded and bent, could return to the crucible and emerge as something entirely new. What made bronze unusual, what separated it from simpler materials, wasn't its strength or its durability. It was the sheer improbability of its existence. Bronze required two metals, copper and tin. You'd think they might be found together, that nature would be kind enough to place them side by side. It didn't. Copper you could find readily enough in several regions scattered around the Mediterranean. The island of Cyprus, sitting between Anatolia and the Levantine shore, held copper deposits so rich they'd be worked for millennia. The ores could be spotted in hillsides, marked by telltale green staining on the rocks. Tin was another matter entirely. Tin was scarce in ways that reshaped the world. Its sources lay far away, in places most Bronze Age people would never see and could barely imagine. By the middle of the second millennium BC, around 1500 BC, tin was traveling extraordinary distances before it reached the workshops that desperately needed it. It came from Afghanistan, perhaps, from the edges of the known world in Anatolia's distant interior, possibly from lands so far west along the Mediterranean that they existed more as rumor than certainty. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Every bronze object, no matter how mundane, implied a journey. That sickle in the farmer's hand, its copper might have been mined on Cyprus by workers who never farmed a day in their lives, men who descended into hot, dark shafts and emerged with ore that others would smelt. The tin in that same sickle had traveled hundreds of miles, maybe 1,000, passing through multiple hands and across multiple territories. It crossed mountains. It was loaded and unloaded from donkeys, carts, and ships. It waited in warehouses in cities the farmer would never visit. A spearhead carried by a Mycenaean warrior contained metal from opposite ends of the known world. The routes that brought these materials together weren't abstract lines on a map. They were real paths, worn by real feet and hooves and wagon wheels. They required maintenance. They needed to be kept clear of bandits, negotiated with local powers, supplied with water and fodder at regular intervals. These routes had to remain passable year after year, generation after generation. By around 1400 BC, more than 3,400 years ago, this elaborate system had matured into something that felt almost natural. Ships sailed regularly between Egypt's delta and Cyprus, between the Levantine ports and the harbors of Crete, between the Aegean islands and the Anatolian coast. They didn't travel blindly. Crews knew the winds, the seasons, the harbors that welcomed them. They knew how long a journey should take, which stars to follow, where to shelter when storms came up suddenly in autumn. Inland, caravans followed routes that were well established enough to have names, though those names have mostly been lost to us now. Donkeys and oxen pulled carts across valleys that had seen this traffic for so long that the paths were worn into the land itself. Rest stops appeared at predictable intervals. Water sources were known. Danger points, narrow passes, exposed stretches were recognized and respected. The remarkable thing about all this movement was its regularity. This wasn't adventure. It was work. It was seasonal, scheduled, expected. When metal didn't arrive on time, people noticed and worried. They made adjustments, sent messages, rearranged their plans. But usually, it arrived. The system had proven itself reliable for so long that reliability became an assumption built into how workshops operated, how palaces planned, how armies equipped themselves. This dependence on distant materials fundamentally changed how labor was organized. Mining happened far from where most people lived, often in hot, difficult terrain where nothing much else could be done. It was hard work, dangerous work, the kind that broke bodies and shortened lives. The miners themselves probably never saw the finished products their labor made possible. Smelting was its own specialized knowledge. You couldn't just heat copper ore and hope for the best. The process required controlled temperatures, specific conditions, an understanding of what the metal should look like at each stage. The color of the flames mattered. The consistency of the molten metal told you whether you were succeeding or about to waste an entire batch. This knowledge was gained through years of practice. passed from experienced smelters to apprentices who watched and learned and eventually tried it themselves. Casting demanded different skills again. Molds had to be prepared carefully. The metal had to be poured at the right temperature, not so hot. It damaged the mold, not so cool it failed to fill every crevice. Then came the waiting. Metal took time to cool, and impatience here ruined everything. Rush it, and you'd crack your mold or warp your casting. So you waited. You learned patience because the material demanded it. Not everyone could participate in these processes. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Bronze production concentrated in specific places, near palaces, in workshop districts, anywhere institutions existed that could sustain the necessary infrastructure. You needed storage for raw materials. You needed fuel, which meant access to wood or charcoal, which meant either nearby forests or trade relationships that could supply it. You needed skilled workers who could focus on this craft rather than splitting their time between metalworking and farming. This concentration meant that authority and metal became intertwined. The people who controlled access to bronze didn't necessarily work with it themselves. A palace official who'd never held a hammer in his life might oversee the distribution of bronze tools to farmers who depended on them for their livelihoods. An administrator who couldn't cast a blade might calculate how many weapons could be produced from a given shipment of ingots. This created distance between the making and the using. A farmer might spend his entire life working with bronze tools without ever understanding exactly how they came to be in his hands. He knew they could be repaired, that broken pieces should be saved and returned, that new tools were issued at certain times according to procedures he didn't fully grasp. The tool was immediate and personal. The system that provided it was remote and institutional. Yet for all this complexity, for all the dependencies and distances involved, the world by around 1300 BC, 1300 years before Christ, 3300 years before now, didn't feel precarious to those living in it. Bronze had been around long enough, centuries by this point, that it felt permanent. Old tools were routinely collected and remelted. Broken implements went into the recycling stream rather than being discarded. Even small fragments retained value because the metal itself was what mattered, not the particular form it currently held. The surface of old bronze objects told stories through their marks. You could see where they'd been repaired. You could trace the wear patterns from decades of use. Some pieces passed through multiple forms over their lifetimes, cast as one thing, melted down, recast as something else, used again, repaired, used further, eventually retired and melted once more. The metal had a kind of immortality that human lives lacked. Bronze also carried social meaning in ways that went beyond its practical utility. Certain forms and finishes indicated status. A ceremonial weapon was immediately distinguishable from a working tool, not just by its decoration but by its proportions, its balance, its very presence. Drinking vessels followed shapes that were understood across regions. An Egyptian would recognize a Mycenaean cup's function, even if its style was foreign. This shared vocabulary of forms allowed objects to communicate even when their owners couldn't speak the same language. In religious contexts, bronze anchored ritual in material permanence. Temple offerings were often cast in metal specifically because they'd endure. A bronze figurine placed before a god would outlast any wooden statue, any clay vessel, any textile offering. This durability seemed appropriate for objects meant to maintain an ongoing relationship between humans and the divine. The metal didn't decay, and neither, it was hoped, would the gods favor. Temples themselves absorbed bronze into their architectural vocabulary. Fittings on doors, vessels for libations, implements for sacrifice. All were crafted in metal that would withstand repeated use and ritual cleaning. The same forms appeared generation after generation because ritual demanded continuity. Change would have implied uncertainty about whether the gods would still recognize what was being offered. In administrative spaces, bronze functioned as infrastructure rather than symbol. Weights used to measure grain were typically cast in metal because they needed to resist wear. A stone weight might chip or crack. A metal weight would hold its mass through countless transactions. Scales required bronze fittings that could bear repeated stress without failing at inconvenient moments. Storage facilities used metal hinges, locks, and fastenings that would last years rather than seasons. The documents that tracked all this trade and storage rarely mentioned bronze's origin directly. They noted quantities, recorded distributions, tracked debts and credits, but embedded in every transaction was the assumption that metal tools would be available, that containers would function, that the material infrastructure enabling administration would continue to exist. Bronze was so fundamental it became invisible in the records, present only through absence when something failed or was delayed. No Bronze Age society could sustain this system alone. That's crucial to understand. Self-sufficiency was impossible once bronze became central to daily life. Cyprus had abundant copper but needed tin desperately. Regions with access to tin often lacked copper entirely. Areas rich in both metals might have no grain surplus. Islands had harbors but needed mainland agriculture. Coastal settlements controlled trade but depended on inland production. These dependencies had developed slowly enough that they seemed natural rather than constructed. A young person growing up around 1250 BC had never known a world where metal didn't arrive regularly, where tools couldn't be repaired or replaced, where the complex chain of production and distribution wasn't simply how things worked. Their grandparents had known such a world, perhaps, but those memories had faded into the general past, into the time before things were as they now were. This confidence was earned, in a sense. The system had proven itself across generations. Crises had occurred before. Droughts, conflicts, interrupted routes, and had been managed. Solutions had been found. Trade resumed. Production continued. Each successfully navigated difficulty reinforced the sense that the world, for all its complexity, was fundamentally stable. What was harder to see was how this success had gradually narrowed the margins for error. As the system became more efficient, it also became more precisely calibrated. There was less slack, fewer buffers, reduced redundancy. When everything worked, this efficiency was beautiful. Goods flowed smoothly from source to destination. Workshops maintained steady production. Palaces could plan seasons ahead with reasonable confidence. But the same tight coordination that enabled this efficiency also meant that disruptions in one place rippled outward with greater effect. A delayed shipment didn't just inconvenience one workshop. It affected production schedules that had been carefully synchronized. A poor harvest in one region required compensation from stores that might already be committed elsewhere. The system had learned to operate with impressive precision, which made it less able to absorb the imprecise chaos of unexpected trouble. None of this was obvious in the daily texture of life. People woke, worked, ate, slept, and died within a world that felt solid. The ground beneath their feet was ancient. The buildings around them had stood for generations. The rhythms of the year-planting season, harvest time, the arrival and departure of ships, repeated themselves with comforting regularity. Children born around 1200 BC entered a world that had already existed in roughly this form for longer than anyone could accurately remember. The roots were ancient, the skills were traditional, the metal continued to arrive. What existed was not a system teetering on the edge of failure, but one grounded in centuries of accumulated experience. It was a world bound by bronze, held together by distance become routine, by complexity become invisible, by success so complete it seemed permanent. Stand on any shore of the eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, and you'd understand quickly that the sea wasn't a boundary. It was a road. Actually, it was better than most roads, smoother, more reliable, capable of moving heavier loads than any ox cart could manage. For the people who lived around its edges, from roughly 1500 BC onward, the sea connected rather than separated. It made neighbors of places that would have been isolated by land. This wasn't theoretical. Ships moved constantly between the Nile Delta and the Levantine coast, between Cyprus and Anatolia, between Crete and the mainland, between the Aegean Islands and everywhere else. By around 1400 BC, these voyages had been happening for so long that they'd worn themselves into the calendar year just as surely as planting and harvest. Spring brought certain winds. Summer allowed longer journeys. Autumn required caution. Winter stopped most travel entirely, forcing everyone to wait for the season to turn. The people who did this work, the sailors, the pilots, the merchants, weren't explorers. They were professionals following known routes. They'd learned from others who'd learned from others, knowledge passing down through apprenticeship and experience. A pilot knew his route the way a farmer knew his fields. He recognized headlands, could read the color of water to judge depth, understood which winds meant weather was changing and which were just the usual afternoon breeze. Voyages stopped regularly at anchorages that had served this purpose for generations. Some were natural harbors where protection from wind and waves was obvious. Others were less obvious but known to work. Places where local conditions created shelter that wasn't apparent until you tried it. These anchorages acquired names, accumulated local knowledge about water sources and seasonal hazards, became nodes in a network of movement that spanned the entire eastern Mediterranean. The ships themselves reflected this mature system. By the late Bronze Age, around 1300 BC, shipwrights had developed forms that balanced cargo capacity against sailing performance, durability against cost. Ships were substantial investments. The timber alone represented months of work and significant expense. Cedar from Lebanon was prized for shipbuilding, its wood resistant to rot, strong enough to bear heavy loads, straight-grained enough to work cleanly. A ship built of good cedar might serve for decades if properly cared for. They were maintained carefully, repaired regularly, pulled ashore during winter to protect them from storm damage. What they carried varied with season and route. Grain moved from Egypt, where the Nile's annual flooding ensured relatively reliable harvests. The inundation arrived every summer like clockwork, depositing rich silt across the floodplain, making Egyptian agriculture remarkably productive compared to rain-dependent farming elsewhere. This surplus grain fed not just Egypt, but much of the eastern Mediterranean during difficult years. Cyprus exported copper in massive ingots shaped like ox hides, each weighing somewhere between 20 and 30 kilograms, as much as a full-grown man could comfortably carry. These distinctive shapes weren't arbitrary. The four protruding corners made them easier to handle with ropes, and the standardized form meant everyone knew what they were getting. A ship might stack dozens of these ingots in its hold, each one representing days of mining, smelting, and casting work. Tin arrived from its distant sources, precious enough that even small quantities justified long journeys. A merchant might travel for months to secure a shipment of tin, knowing that back-home workshops were waiting desperately for it. Without tin, all the copper in the world was useless for making bronze. This made tin traders powerful, despite dealing in relatively small quantities. They controlled the bottleneck. Wine traveled in pointed amphorae that could be stacked efficiently in a ship's hold, each vessel's pointed bottom fitting into the mouth of the one below it. These weren't just containers, they were also units of measure, standardized enough that you could specify quantities in terms of amphorae and be reasonably sure what you were getting. Oil moved in similar vessels, though the exact shapes differed slightly to distinguish contents at a glance. Textiles were valuable cargo despite their light weight. Fine cloth from Egypt, purple-dyed wool from the Levantine coast, linen woven to extraordinary fineness. These could be worth more than their weight in copper. A bolt of exceptionally fine cloth might buy a dozen bronze tools or feed a family for months. Dyes themselves were trade goods. particularly the famous Tyrian purple extracted from murex shells at enormous labor cost. Ivory arrived from Africa and Syria, carved or raw, destined for palace workshops where skilled artisans would transform it into decorative inlays, gaming pieces, and ornate furniture fittings. Incense and aromatic resins came from distant sources, frankincense and myrrh moving north from Arabia, valued in temple rituals and elite contexts across the Mediterranean world. But here's something easy to miss. The distinction between trade goods and diplomatic gifts was often unclear, sometimes deliberately so. The same items might move as commercial cargo in one context and as royal presents in another. What mattered wasn't the label, but the relationship. A palace sending copper to an allied court might describe it as a gift in correspondence, while treating it practically as trade. The language of diplomacy and the language of commerce overlapped and blended. This ambiguity served useful purposes. It allowed rulers to maintain face while engaging in what was essentially commercial exchange. A king didn't haggle like a merchant, but he certainly kept track of the value of gifts exchanged and expected rough reciprocity over time. Letters between rulers sometimes make this explicit, mentioning previous gifts and suggesting, always politely, that equivalent return would be appreciated. Cyprus sat at the center of this maritime world, and its position was both blessing and burden. The island's copper deposits were extraordinary, rich enough to supply workshops across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Mines in the Troodos Mountains had been worked for centuries by 1400 BC, with new shafts still being opened as older ones played out or became too dangerous to work. Archaeological evidence shows extensive mining operations, with galleries extending deep underground, sophisticated drainage systems to keep workings dry, and specialized tools adapted to the harsh conditions. The mining settlements themselves were rough places, home to workers whose labor was essential, but whose lives were hard and often short. Mining copper ore in the Bronze Age was brutally difficult. Miners worked by firelight underground, heating rock faces with fire, then dousing them with water to fracture the stone. They breathed air thick with dust and smoke. Cave-ins were a constant danger. Many miners probably suffered from silicosis and other respiratory diseases. Their skeletons, when found, often show signs of physical stress and trauma. The copper went down to the coast as ore, or as partially processed metal, transported by donkey trains along paths worn deep into the hillsides. At coastal workshops, smelting facilities processed the ore through multiple stages of heating and refining. The smelters themselves were skilled specialists who could judge by color and behavior when the metal was ready, when it needed more heating, when impurities were still present. From smelting facilities, refined copper was cast into those distinctive oxhide-shaped ingots. The casting process itself required skill. Pour too fast and you get air bubbles that weakened the metal. Too slow, and the metal might begin to solidify before the mold was full. Each ingot was a standardized unit that could be counted, stacked, transported, and traded. A ship might carry dozens of these ingots, representing thousands of hours of labor and enough copper to keep workshops supplied for months. But copper alone was useless for making bronze. Without tin, you just had copper softer than bronze, less durable, harder to cast into complex forms, more prone to deformation under stress. And tin was tin's own complicated problem. Nobody in the Bronze Age Mediterranean was entirely certain where all of it came from. And that uncertainty was itself a source of vulnerability. Some tin definitely came from Anatolia's interior, from sources in the mountainous regions east of the Hittite heartland. The Kutepeh tablets, dating to around 1900 BC, document extensive tin trade organized by Assyrian merchants who established trading colonies across Anatolia. By the late Bronze Age, around 1300 BC, these overland routes were still functioning, though the political geography had changed considerably. Some tin possibly came from even further east, from Afghanistan's mountain valleys, traveling trade routes so long that individual merchants might handle only one segment of the journey. This tin would have passed through multiple intermediaries, each one adding their margin, before eventually reaching Mediterranean markets. The journey could take years. Tin arriving in a Mycenaean workshop might have begun its journey when that workshop's master craftsman was still a young apprentice. There's evidence, contested, debated, never quite definitively proven, that some tin came from the far western Mediterranean, perhaps from Iberia, or even from the Atlantic coast beyond. If this is true, it means tin was traveling the entire length of the Mediterranean, a journey measured in months under the best conditions. The improbability of this logistics chain becomes almost comical when you think about it carefully. Tin from the western edge of the known world, copper from Cyprus meeting in workshops in Greece or Anatolia or the Levant. And yet it worked. For centuries it worked. Tin arrived. Bronze was cast. The system functioned with remarkable reliability, considering how many things had to go right. This success created its own vulnerability. When everything works for long enough, you stop planning for failure. You stop maintaining redundancies. You optimize for efficiency rather than resilience. The movement of these materials created dependencies that nobody had consciously designed, but which had evolved through practice over generations. A workshop in Mycenae, let's say around 1250 BC, depended on Cypriot copper and tin from somewhere else entirely, possibly from sources thousands of kilometers away. If either source failed, production stopped. Simple as that. There was no local alternative. No backup plan would work quickly enough to prevent disruption. This made bronze work simultaneously evidence of the system's success and its vulnerability. The very existence of bronze objects proved that coordination worked, that materials could be gathered from distant sources and combined by skilled hands. But that same existence depended on the continuation of conditions that had held for so long they seemed permanent, but which were actually contingent on dozens of factors remaining aligned. Trade routes weren't just physical paths through space. They were also networks of relationships built and maintained through repeated interactions over years and generations. A merchant arriving at a port he'd visited before might find welcome based on previous good dealings. He knew people there, had established credit, understood local customs and expectations around greeting, negotiation, and transaction. This social infrastructure mattered as much as the physical routes. Trust built over repeated transactions allowed goods to move more smoothly than they ever could between strangers. A merchant might accept promises of future payment from someone whose father he'd dealt with for decades. He might store goods in someone else's warehouse, trusting they'd still be there when he returned. These relationships had value that couldn't be reduced to simple economic calculation. They represented accumulated confidence that took years to build and could be destroyed in moments. Written correspondence helped maintain these relationships across distance and time. By the late Bronze Age, particularly by 1400 to 1300 BC, diplomatic correspondence between courts was routine enough that standard practices had developed. Clay tablets moved alongside cargo, carrying instructions, acknowledgements, requests, and courtesies. The Amama letters, discovered in Egypt and dating primarily to the 14th century BC, provide extraordinary glimpses into this correspondence network. The language of these letters followed conventions that made them recognizable even when written in different languages by different scribes. Akkadian served as something like a lingua franca of diplomacy, used even by Egyptian pharaohs writing to Levantine rulers, by Hittite kings corresponding with Egyptian courts, by Cypriot kings communicating with various mainland powers. This wasn't anyone's native language. It was administration's common tongue, learned by specialist scribes trained specifically for this purpose. A typical letter might begin with elaborate formal greetings, listing the sender's titles and the recipient's titles with proper respect. It might invoke relationships established by previous exchanges, referring to the other ruler as brother, in contexts where actual kinship didn't exist, but symbolic kinship expressed alliance. Then came the substance requests for specific goods or assistance, explanations of delays or difficulties, promises of future reciprocation, sometimes complaints about previous slights or unmet obligations. The tone was usually carefully measured, diplomatic in the modern sense, even when addressing significant problems. This reflected the fact that these correspondents expected to be dealing with each other for years, possibly decades. Burning bridges had obvious costs. Better to maintain working relationships, even through difficulties, than to create permanent breaches over temporary problems. Some letters are remarkably direct about the transactional nature underlying diplomatic gift exchange. One ruler might write noting that he sent X amount of some valuable good and would appreciate receiving Y in return. Another might complain that a previous gift was insufficient or of poor quality, requesting better in the future. These aren't subtle hints. They're straightforward accounting of obligations and expectations. Other letters deal with practical matters of trade and security, requests for safe passage for merchants, inquiries about whether routes are currently safe, messages about shipwrecks or banditry, requests for extradition of fugitives or return of stolen goods. The mundane infrastructure of international relations appears in these baked clay tablets, preserved accidentally when the buildings containing them burned. Seals pressed into clay authenticated these documents. Each major court had distinctive seal designs that served as signatures, as guarantees of authenticity. The imagery on seals often drew from religious or royal iconography specific to particular dynasties or regions. A trained scribe could look at a seal impression and know immediately where it came from, whether it was likely legitimate, what authority it represented. Merchants carried seals too, smaller and simpler but serving the same basic function. They certified that the bearer was who he claimed to be, and that transactions conducted with him would be honored by the authority behind the seal. This system wasn't perfect. Seals could be stolen or forged. But it worked well enough to facilitate trade across regions where personal recognition wasn't possible. Weights and measures showed remarkable standardization across this world, though not perfect uniformity. Local variations certainly existed, and sometimes caused confusion or required conversion. But there was enough alignment that trade could proceed without constant renegotiation of basic terms. A weight standard used in Egypt would be close enough to one used in the Levant that traders could work together with reasonable confidence. The shekel appears as a weight measure across much of the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, though the exact mass it represented varied somewhat by region and period. Similarly, measures for grain, for oil, for wine, all showed patterns of rough standardization that had developed through practice rather than being imposed by any central authority. This practical standardization emerged from necessity rather than coordination. If every port used completely different measures, every transaction would require time-consuming conversion and verification, slowing trade to a crawl and creating opportunities for disputes. Instead, standards converged toward common forms through countless individual adjustments over generations. A merchant who wanted to trade efficiently adopted measures his trading partners would recognize. Over time, this practical pressure created systems that worked across regions. Ships themselves carried more than cargo. Crews brought news, information that traveled faster by sea than by almost any other means in the Bronze Age world. A ship arriving from Cyprus might bring word of harvests there, of political changes, of disturbances along trade routes, of other ships that had been delayed or lost. This information network moved invisibly alongside the visible trade in goods, and it mattered enormously for decision-making. The speed of this information transfer was crucial. A palace in the Levant might learn of developments in Egypt weeks before formal diplomatic correspondence arrived. This advance warning allowed for adjustments, for preparations, for decisions made with better information than would otherwise be available. In a world where communication was slow by modern standards, where a message might take weeks or months to reach its destination, this maritime news network provided a significant advantage. Port officials became specialists in managing the intersection between sea and land, between foreign traders and local authorities. They needed multiple skills, record-keeping, obviously, but also negotiation, conflict resolution, enough multilingual ability to communicate with diverse visitors or access to reliable translators. A major harbor wasn't just a place where ships loaded and unloaded. It was an administrative center where arrivals and departures were recorded, where customs or taxes might be collected, where disputes could be resolved before they escalated into problems that damaged trade relationships. These officials developed expertise in the practical details that made trade work. They knew which merchants were reliable, which products typically moved through their port, what seasonal patterns affected traffic, which routes were currently safe and which should be avoided. This accumulated knowledge had real value. A well-managed port attracted more traffic, which generated more revenue and more connection to the broader network. Warehouses near harbors stored goods in transit, items waiting for ships or for inland transport. These weren't simple sheds. They were substantial buildings, often stone-built, designed to protect valuable cargo from weather and theft. The organization of these spaces mattered. Goods needed to be accessible but secure, identifiable but space-efficient. Someone had to track what was stored where, when it arrived, who owned it, when ships were expected to carry it onward. The logistics of moving items from ship to warehouse to final destination required planning and coordination that's easy to overlook. Cargo couldn't just pile up randomly at docks. It needed to be sorted, allocated, protected, moved efficiently. Labor had to be organized. Dock workers to unload ships, warehouse workers to store and retrieve goods, transport workers to move items inland or load outbound vessels. All of this required management. As ships arrived and departed following seasonal patterns, ports experienced rhythms of busy and quiet that structured life there. Spring might see intense activity as winter delayed voyages all arrived at once, everyone rushing to make up for lost time. Summer brought steady traffic, ships arriving and departing in relatively predictable patterns. Autumn saw a final rush before winter made travel dangerous, merchants trying to complete one more voyage before settling in for months of waiting. Then came the quiet. Winter meant few ships moved except for coastal traffic under desperate circumstances. Ports turned inward, focusing on local affairs, maintaining infrastructure, planning for the next season. The waiting was real and significant. A merchant whose goods arrived in autumn might have to wait months before ships could carry them onward. This tied-up capital required payment for storage, created uncertainty about whether spring would bring the expected resumption of traffic. The entire system had to account for these pauses, building them into planning and expectations. Nobody expected constant flow. They expected seasonal rhythms and organized their affairs accordingly. Contracts specified delivery times that accounted for sailing seasons. Palace administrators planned distributions around the timing of expected arrivals. Everyone worked within the constraints that the sea imposed. What's striking about this network, by around 1300 BC, is how ordinary it had become. Maritime trade wasn't exotic or remarkable. It was routine work, conducted by professionals, expected by everyone who depended on it. Children growing up in port cities would have seen ships their entire lives, would have understood from an early age that their world was connected to distant places by regular maritime contact. The exotic was normal. The distant was familiar. This ordinariness was actually the system's greatest achievement. When something extraordinary becomes ordinary through long success, when complex coordination becomes invisible through habituation, that's when a system has truly matured. The Eastern Mediterranean network by the Late Bronze Age had reached exactly this point. It worked so consistently that people stopped thinking about it working. They simply expected it to, and most of the time, their expectations were met. The sea that connected these societies was the same sea that had always been there, but the use of it had transformed it into something like a highway system, busy with traffic, marked by known routes, understood through long experience. What had once required courage and luck now required mainly competence and patience. The romance had been replaced by routine, and that replacement was progress. But this very success, this very ordinariness, made it difficult to imagine the system not working. When you've never experienced failure, when reliability extends back beyond living memory, the possibility of breakdown becomes abstract, theoretical, unreal. The sea would always carry ships. Ships would always carry cargo. Bronze would always be available. These weren't hopes. They were facts, proven by generations of experience. For now, in the decades around 1250 BC, this confidence remained justified. The network still functioned. The ships still sailed. The goods still moved. Cyprus sent copper. Tin arrived from distant sources. Grain moved from Egypt. The world held together, bound by movement that had become so reliable it was taken for granted. That assumption of reliability would matter enormously when conditions changed. If you walked through the corridors of a Bronze Age palace around 1300 BC, let's say at Pylos in southwestern Greece, or Knossos on Crete, or any of a dozen major administrative centers scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, your first impression might be how busy it was without being exactly crowded. People moved with purpose through spaces that seemed designed for movement. They carried things, clay tablets fresh from scribal hands, baskets woven from reeds, ceramic jars sealed with clay stoppers, bronze tools wrapped in linen, folded textiles that took two people to manage properly. They stopped in doorways to exchange words, voices echoing off plaster walls. They waited in courtyards for meetings or instructions, sitting on benches worn smooth by generations of similar waiting. Few seemed to actually live there in the residential sense. Most were passing through, arriving to deliver or collect or report, then leaving again to wherever their actual homes were. These weren't royal residences in the way later European palaces would be. Grand spaces primarily devoted to displaying wealth and housing monarchs in luxurious isolation. Bronze Age palaces were administrative centers first, economic hubs where coordination happened. Yes, rulers and their immediate households occupied certain sections, private quarters set apart from the working areas. But much of the space, often most of it, was devoted to other purposes: storage rooms stacked to their ceilings, workshops where specialists practiced their crafts, offices where scribes bent over tablets, courtyards where goods were examined and counted and argued over. The architecture itself reflected this function: thick walls to support upper stories and protect valuable contents, wide doors and corridors designed for moving large items, spaces organized for efficient circulation rather than aesthetic impact. Storage dominated. This can't be overstated. Walk down any corridor in a major palace and you'd pass room after room filled with massive clay storage jars, pitoi, some standing taller than a grown person. These held grain brought in from surrounding fields, according to schedules that someone, somewhere in this warren of rooms, was carefully tracking on tablets that would themselves end up stored in archives. The grain itself represented thousands of hours of agricultural labor from dozens or hundreds of farming households, all of it flowing into these centralized facilities where it waited to be redistributed. Oil filled other storage rooms, sealed in smaller but still substantial vessels. Each jar bore markings identifying its contents, its origin, sometimes even the quality grade. Wine accumulated in dedicated spaces, the amphorae arranged systematically so that older vintages could be retrieved without disturbing newer ones. These weren't random collections. They were carefully organized inventories, maintained by specialists who knew exactly what was stored where. The palace didn't produce these goods directly. That's worth emphasizing. Farmers grew the grain on their own land, or on land they worked for the palace. Olive growers tended their trees through years of growth before the first harvest. Vintners managed vines that might be decades old. The palace gathered these products in, held them temporarily, then sent them back out according to complex calculations that balanced obligation, need, and political consideration. Textiles occupied substantial storage space as well. Wool came in as fleeces from shepherds managing flocks on hillsides, was distributed to spinners and weavers who worked in their own homes or in palace, affiliated workshops, then returned as finished cloth. The quality varied: coarse cloth for everyday use, finer weaves for special purposes, exceptionally fine work destined for trade or diplomatic gifts. The system tracked all of this with remarkable precision. We know this because at sites like Pylos and Knossos, tablets survived that recorded these transactions in meticulous detail. The survival of these records is itself darkly ironic. They were meant to be temporary, working documents that would be discarded once the information they contained was no longer needed or had been transferred to more permanent records. But when fire destroyed these palaces around 1200 BC, it baked the clay tablets hard, preserving them for millennia. What was supposed to be ephemeral became permanent. What was destroyed became evidence. The scribes who created these records worked at modest stations scattered throughout the palace complex. Nothing elaborate. A bench along a wall, a low table, space for clay and styluses. Light came from doorways or small windows, sometimes from oil lamps when work continued into evening. The scribes shaped soft clay into tablets using practiced movements refined over years of daily work, pressing marks with styluses to create the distinctive wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform, or, in the Mycenaean palaces, the flowing lines of linear B script. Each mark represented accumulated knowledge. Learning to write these scripts required years of training, starting in childhood for most scribes. They memorized hundreds of signs, learned the conventions of administrative language, practiced until the physical movements became automatic. Most people walking past these scribal stations couldn't read what was being written. They recognized authority in the act of writing itself, understood that these marks had power, but the specific content remained opaque. The language of palace administration had its own specialized vocabulary and rigid conventions. Quantities appeared in standard formats. Personal names followed consistent patterns. Each type of transaction, grain distribution, textile allocation, bronze tool disbursement, livestock counting, had its template. A trained scribe could glance at a tablet and immediately grasp its purpose and contents, even if it had been created by a different scribe months earlier in a different section of the palace. This standardization made the system efficient but also brittle. If the conventions were lost, if the trained personnel disappeared, the entire administrative apparatus would become incomprehensible. Rations flowed outward from palace storerooms in carefully measured streams. Workers received grain according to established allocations that varied by status, work type, and household size. A skilled craftsman might receive more than a field laborer. Families were factored into calculations. Wives and children counted for reduced amounts compared to adult male workers. The system attempted precision, though the precision served administrative convenience rather than generosity. These distributions followed calendars that everyone involved understood through long experience. A worker knew when to expect rations, knew the quantity that should arrive, would notice immediately if something was wrong. The predictability created a kind of security, though it was security entirely dependent on the palace system continuing to function. If the palace stopped distributing rations for any reason, workers simply stopped receiving them. There was no backup, no alternative system to fall back on. Workshops clustered around palaces or in nearby settlements, close enough to receive supplies and supervision, but not necessarily within palace walls themselves. Potters worked clay into vessels sized according to standard measures that had been established generations earlier. These weren't artistic expressions. They were functional containers made to specifications as precise as the bureaucracy could enforce. A storage jar for grain needed to hold a certain volume. An amphora for wine followed established forms. Production was efficient because it was repetitive, the same shapes produced over and over with variations only where function demanded them. Metalworkers, when they had access to bronze, produced tools and weapons according to similar standards. You could calculate how many sickles to expect from a given quantity of metal, so many spearheads per ingot. The ratios were known, the process is standardized. Broken tools returned to workshops to be remelted, entering the production cycle again. Even casting failures had value. A botched spearhead wasn't waste, just material for the next attempt. Weavers faced their own set of constraints and expectations. The cloth they produced had to meet quality standards set by palace administrators who might inspect finished work. Weave too loosely and the cloth might be rejected, the weaver's ration reduced. Work too slowly and productivity would be noted, recorded, potentially penalized. The tablets from Pylos actually record such details: which weavers met their assigned quotas, which fell short, who received standard rations, and who received reduced amounts as consequence or perhaps incentive. This sounds harsh when described so directly, and it probably was harsh by modern standards. But it likely felt less oppressive in practice, simply because these were the normal conditions of work for anyone connected to palace economies. The rations came regularly. The work was steady. There was reliability to it that independent farming or craft work might lack, where you bore all the risk of bad harvests or insufficient demand. You traded autonomy for security, and in a world where food security was never entirely guaranteed, where one bad season could mean starvation, that trade made practical sense to many people. For most residents of Bronze Age kingdoms, the palace was present without being personal. Farmers delivered a portion of their harvest to collection points, perhaps a quarter, perhaps a third, the exact proportion varying by region and circumstance, and then returned to their fields to work the land that sustained them directly. They might never see the palace itself, might never interact with anyone they'd recognize as genuinely powerful. Shepherds counted animals for tax purposes, had the numbers recorded by an official they'd likely never see again, then moved on to continue the actual work of herding. The palace existed as an obligation, a destination for goods, a source of occasional demands, but not as a place of daily personal interaction for most people. This distance between authority and subject probably made the system more sustainable in some ways. Resentment is harder to maintain toward abstractions than toward individuals you interact with regularly. Festivals and ceremonies brought temporary changes to this pattern. These were moments when palaces opened outward, when accumulated surplus was displayed or redistributed, when the relationship between rulers and ruled was performed and reinforced through ritual. A successful harvest might be celebrated with distributions that went beyond standard rations. Extra grain, wine, perhaps oil, shared in communal feasting that acknowledged collective effort and divine favor. Religious ceremonies involved processions, elaborate sacrifices, feasting that included wider participation than normal administrative routine allowed. These moments mattered enormously for social cohesion. They reminded people that the palace system wasn't purely extractive. It also provided, organized, coordinated. It made possible gatherings and celebrations that individuals or small communities couldn't manage alone. The legitimacy of palace authority rested partly on this demonstrated capacity. A palace that couldn't provide during festivals, that had no surplus to display, that appeared diminished or weak. Such a palace risked losing authority in ways that might only become clear much later. Conversely, a palace that could stage impressive ceremonies, that could distribute generously during festivals while still maintaining adequate stores, reinforced its position without needing to rely on force. Religion and administration were deeply, inextricably intertwined in these societies. Temples received substantial resources directly from palace stores. Priesthoods held significant status, often ranking among the most important palace officials. Religious festivals followed calendars that structured the year as much as agricultural seasons did. Times for planting rituals, harvest celebrations, ceremonies marking solstices or other astronomical events that had been observed for generations. The tablets record offerings to gods with the same matter-of-fact detail they use for grain distributions to workers. So many jars of oil to Poseidon, so many cattle to Potnia, the great goddess. These were standard allocations, maintained year after year, as much a part of palace obligations as feeding workers or maintaining infrastructure. The gods needed to be sustained as relationships, kept satisfied through regular offerings and proper ritual observance. Neglect might bring disaster, though the cause and effect relationship was impossible to prove or disprove. A drought could be interpreted as divine displeasure, evidence that something had been done wrong or left undone. A successful harvest might suggest the gods were pleased, that rituals had been performed correctly, that the cosmic order was maintained. The system of offerings helped manage this relationship, providing structure and predictable expectations that reduced anxiety about capricious divine will. Authority within palace systems remained largely impersonal for most people. They never saw their ruler, or if they did, it was from a distance during ceremonies where the ruler appeared as a ritual figure rather than as an individual. Daily interactions were with intermediaries, overseers who assigned work, scribes who recorded deliveries, storekeepers who distributed rations, various officials whose exact titles and roles might be mysterious, but whose immediate authority was unmistakable. These intermediaries made the decisions that directly affected ordinary lives. When your ration was delayed, you spoke with an overseer, not a king. When work assignments changed, instructions came through foremen and officials you recognized by sight, even if you didn't know their names. When disputes arose, they were settled at low levels if possible, only escalating to higher authority if absolutely necessary. This created a kind of bureaucratic distance between power and its exercise. Authority was present but mediated, exercised through systems and roles rather than through direct personal relationships. For ordinary people, this meant learning to navigate institutional procedures rather than cultivating personal obligations with powerful individuals. You needed to understand how the system worked, which offices handled what types of business, which officials had authority over your particular concerns, what forms and procedures had to be followed. The year's rhythm structured everyone's expectations with predictable regularity. Spring brought planting, the crucial period when everything depended on getting seeds into ground at the right time. Summer brought heat and waiting, maintaining crops, hoping for adequate rainfall in regions that depended on it. Autumn brought harvest, and the intense work of bringing crops in before weather turned. Winter brought relative quiet, time for maintenance, repair, planning, and rest. Administrative cycles mirrored these agricultural patterns. Accounting intensified after harvests when new grain flowed into palace storage in large quantities. Distribution schedules adjusted to seasonal availability, more generous when stores were full, more restricted when they ran lower toward the end of the storage season. Everything moved in rhythms established by nature and refined by generations of experience. This repetition created deep familiarity that went beyond conscious knowledge. People didn't just know what to do. They knew it in their bodies, in rhythms internalized through yearly repetition. Certain weeks meant certain activities. The calendar was lived rather than merely observed. Timing became so reliable that deviation was immediately noticeable and concerning. A delayed distribution, an early requisition. These anomalies stood out against the background of regularity like wrong notes in familiar music. Over generations, this produced a quiet but profound confidence in the system's permanence. Children grew up watching their parents deliver grain to collection points, receive rations at expected times, perform labor obligations as their parents had done. They inherited the same relationships, the same expectations, the same rhythms. The palace system had existed before they were born, and would presumably continue after they died. Its permanence seemed natural, grounded in experience that extended beyond any individual's lifetime into a past that had always been this way. Life within this system wasn't particularly dramatic for most people most of the time. Days followed familiar patterns established by work requirements and seasonal necessities. Labor was hard farming, always is. But it was expected, understood, managed through long experience. The palace's demands were routine rather than surprising. Most people probably didn't spend much time thinking about how remarkable it was that food moved from scattered fields into central storage facilities and back out again, that specialists produced goods they themselves didn't consume, that writing tracked it all in marks most people couldn't read. It was just how things worked, how things had always worked, as far as most people knew or remembered. The complexity that sustained all this remained largely invisible, noticed only when something went wrong, when expected deliveries didn't arrive or anticipated distributions were delayed. Yet underneath this calm surface, the system depended on constant coordination at multiple levels. Every day, hundreds of people made decisions that affected how goods moved through the system. Every week, scribes created new records tracking obligations and disbursements. Every season, the whole process began again, assuming that the previous season's patterns would continue to work, that the structure supporting everything would remain stable. The sound of palace life was distinctive and constant. Footsteps on stone floors, voices echoing in corridors discussing quantities and schedules. The soft, wet sound of clay tablets being pressed and marked. The scrape of heavy storage jars being moved. Doors opening and closing throughout the day as people came and went. The administrative machinery never quite stopped, even when it slowed during quiet periods. There was always something being delivered, recorded, stored, distributed. But there was also silence in these places, particularly in the storage rooms between distributions. Rows of massive jars sat quietly, their sealed contents waiting in darkness. Empty spaces between busy periods felt different, held different kinds of tension. The system worked through both action and waiting, through the busy times and the quiet ones. Both mattered. Both were necessary. For now, in the decades around 1250 BC, this world continued to function much as it had for generations. The palaces stood, substantial buildings that had been added to and modified, but whose essential functions remained constant. The records accumulated in archives that grew larger every year. The seasons turned with comforting predictability. People worked within a framework that had proven itself reliable through long experience, through their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives before that. The complexity that sustained all this remained mostly invisible, noticed only when something failed to work as expected. But when things worked, and they usually did, the system seemed natural rather than constructed, permanent rather than contingent. That sense of permanence would matter enormously when conditions began to change. Most of the time, though, things just worked. Here's something worth considering carefully. The Bronze Age world didn't become complex because anyone planned it that way. It accumulated complexity, the way sediment accumulates in river deltas. Gradually, layer by layer, each addition making sense on its own, while the whole structure slowly grew more intricate. Each generation inherited a system, and then added to it, solving immediate problems with practical solutions that seemed reasonable at the time, but which collectively increased interdependence in ways that weren't obvious until much later. Think about it from the perspective of someone making decisions around, say, 1400 BC. You're an administrator in a palace somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. A poor harvest in your region means grain stores are lower than comfortable, but you have established relationships with other regions that had better harvests. You send messages, make arrangements, import grain to cover the shortfall. Problem solved. This seems like pure competence, leveraging connections to manage local difficulties. and it is competent. It works. The crisis is averted. People don't go hungry. The palace maintains its legitimacy by providing for its dependents even in difficult times. Everyone learns that the system can handle problems, that connections to distant regions provide resilience against local failures. This builds confidence. It justifies the investment in maintaining those connections, in supporting the specialists who manage long-distance exchange, in keeping the whole apparatus of trade and diplomacy functioning. But it also creates dependence. Next time there's a poor harvest, the solution is obvious. Do what worked before. Import grain. Rely on the network. Over time, this becomes standard procedure rather than emergency response. The system adjusts to incorporate this new pattern. Stores might be kept slightly lower locally because they can be supplemented if needed. The margin for error narrows because the backup system seems so reliable. Meanwhile, dozens of other adjustments are happening simultaneously across the region. Another palace is solving its tin shortage by establishing more regular contact with distant suppliers. A third is managing water scarcity by organizing more complex irrigation systems that require coordinated maintenance. A fourth is dealing with increased population by expanding agricultural land, which requires more tools, which increases dependence on bronze supply, which requires more reliable trade connections. None of these individual solutions is wrong. They're all reasonable responses to specific challenges. But collectively, they're weaving a tighter web of interdependence. Each solution adds another strand, connecting distant places and different activities. The web grows stronger in some ways, more redundant connections, more options for moving goods around problems. But it also grows more complex, more dependent on many things working simultaneously. By around 1300 BC, 1300 years before Christ, the system had reached a kind of mature complexity. It could handle problems that would have overwhelmed earlier, simpler arrangements. A drought in one region could be compensated by surplus from another. An interrupted trade route could be replaced by an alternative path. Diplomatic tensions between two kingdoms didn't necessarily disrupt the broader network, because there were multiple connections running through different relationships. This capability encouraged further reliance on the system. When something proves itself effective repeatedly, you use it more, trust it more, build more of your planning around its continued function. Palaces maintained smaller local reserves because they could call on regional reserves. Regions maintained smaller regional reserves because they could trade with other regions. The safety margins that had existed in earlier, simpler times were gradually reduced because they seemed unnecessary given the network's proven reliability. Specialization deepened as part of this same process. Early in the Bronze Age, a metalworker might have handled everything from smelting ore to finishing products, working with whatever materials became available when they became available. By the Late Bronze Age, specialization had narrowed many crafts significantly. Smelting was done by specialists who only smelted. Casting was done by different specialists. Finishing work might be yet another specialty. Each specialist became more skilled at their particular task, more efficient, capable of higher quality work. This increased productivity and quality. These are genuine benefits. But it also meant each specialist was less able to adapt if their particular role became impossible to perform. A casting specialist who suddenly couldn't get refined metal couldn't just go back and start smelting ore. They didn't have the equipment, might not have the knowledge, certainly didn't have the established relationships with ore suppliers. Their specialization made them highly capable within a functioning system and highly vulnerable outside it. The same pattern appeared in administration. Early Bronze Age record-keeping might have been simpler, more flexible, handled by people who also did other things. By 1300 BC, palace administrations employed specialized scribes who did nothing but create and maintain records. This made record-keeping more systematic, more detailed, more reliable. But it also meant the system depended absolutely on continued literacy, on the training that produced new scribes, on the archives where tablets accumulated. Maintaining this increasingly complex system carried costs that weren't always immediately visible. Specialists required steady support, regular rations, appropriate working conditions, tools and materials. This was fine when everything functioned normally, when the goods to support specialists flowed reliably, but it meant the system had a higher baseline requirement just to maintain itself. It needed more input just to stay stable than simpler systems did. Storage infrastructure grew to manage larger volumes moving through the system. More warehouses, larger ones, better organized, with more officials to manage them. This increased capacity, but also increased overhead. Diplomatic relationships required ongoing investment gifts sent, messages exchanged, visits hosted, relationships maintained through continued interaction. None of these costs seemed excessive when viewed individually. Together, they formed a background requirement that assumed stability and regular surplus as baseline conditions. Success reinforced the pattern. When the system functioned well, when crises were managed successfully, this justified continued investment in administrative capacity. More scribes meant better records. Better records meant more effective management. More effective management meant the system could handle increasing complexity. This created a positive feedback loop where capability and complexity grew together. From within, this world didn't feel precarious around 1300 or even 1250 BC. Its reach suggested strength. The fact that Cyprus's copper reached workshops in Mycenae, that Egyptian grain fed people hundreds of kilometers away, that diplomatic correspondence crossed the entire eastern Mediterranean. All of this seemed to demonstrate the system's robustness. Its routines suggested resilience. The repetition of successful patterns implied they would continue. When small failures occurred, a delayed shipment, a poor local harvest, political tensions between neighbors, they were managed locally and absorbed by the broader system without causing general disruption. This created a track record of successful crisis management that reinforced confidence. The system had faced problems before and overcome them. Why would future problems be any different? What was harder to see was how the nature of stress had changed as complexity accumulated. In earlier, simpler systems, problems could be addressed locally with relatively independent responses. A community facing a poor harvest could adjust by eating stored supplies, reducing consumption, maybe borrowing from neighbors. The solutions were local and flexible. In the more complex late Bronze Age system, stress moved through networks in less predictable ways. A problem in one place affected distant places through multiple connections. A delay in one shipment affected production schedules that had been carefully synchronized. A disruption of one trade route required adjustments by multiple parties who might not even know each other. Problems couldn't be solved purely locally anymore. They required coordination across distance. This meant that response times slowed even as problems were being recognized more quickly. Information might flow fast enough that a palace heard about trouble almost immediately. But actually responding, organizing an alternative supply, redirecting shipments, negotiating new arrangements, took time because it involved coordinating multiple parties. The system had become more connected, but also more procedural, more dependent on formal processes rather than ad hoc responses. Authority followed a similar path towards centralization and formalization. In simpler times, local officials might have had significant discretion to solve problems using whatever means seemed appropriate. By the late Bronze Age, authority was more centralized, decisions more likely to be made at higher levels or according to established procedures. This reduced chaos and unpredictability, which had benefits. But it also slowed response and reduced the system's ability to adapt quickly to local conditions. Instructions traveled through more layers before reaching the people who would actually implement them. A problem identified at a local level might need to be reported upward, assessed by officials who weren't directly experiencing it, addressed through decisions made by people far from the actual situation, then communicated back down as instructions. This took time, even when everyone involved was competent and working efficiently. None of this necessarily implied failure was coming. The system continued to operate, often impressively. Its complexity reflected long success rather than imminent collapse. The same structures that supported prosperity, the extensive trade networks, the sophisticated administration, the specialized craft production, also gave Bronze Age societies capabilities that earlier, simpler societies couldn't match. They could field larger armies equipped with more sophisticated weapons. They could build more impressive architecture. They could support larger populations in greater density. They could sustain specialists who created art, literature, and knowledge that wouldn't have been possible if everyone was just subsistence farming. The complexity enabled genuine achievements. What had changed, though, was how the system carried stress. Pressure moved along established channels, meeting resistance where roles were fixed and expectations rigid. The system could still absorb shocks as it always had, but it had less room for deviation from expected patterns. Its strength lay in coordination. When everything lined up properly, it worked beautifully. Its sensitivity lay in dependence. It needed many things to work correctly simultaneously. For people living within it, daily life remained recognizable throughout this period. Work continued. Goods circulated, records accumulated in archives that kept growing. The gradual tightening of connections didn't announce itself dramatically. It existed as a background condition, shaping how things worked without necessarily being visible to people just trying to get through their days. This was the condition of the Bronze Age world as it matured through the 14th and into the 13th century BC. A landscape of interlocking systems refined by generations of use, sustained by habit and mutual dependence, confident in its own durability. The same qualities that had allowed it to grow and flourish now defined how it would respond to whatever challenges came next, without anyone being able to predict in advance what that response would look like, or whether it would be sufficient. The system wasn't fragile in any simple sense. It had proven remarkably resilient across generations. But it was tightly coupled, precisely calibrated, dependent on many things continuing to work. And that combination of resilience and dependence would matter enormously when multiple pressures arrived at once. For now, though, in the mid-13th century BC, the world still worked. The bronze still flowed. The ships still sailed. The palaces still stood. Life continued within patterns that had been established so long ago they seemed eternal. The first indications that something was changing didn't arrive as dramatic announcements. They appeared in the archaeological record as shifts in administrative language, embedded within the same clay tablets that had long documented routine business. The format didn't change. The handwriting remained familiar, but the content began to reveal underlying strain in ways that would only become clear much later when historians examined these documents as a sequence rather than as isolated records. Letters from the early 13th century BC, around 1290 to 1250 BC, generally maintained the confident tone that characterized earlier diplomatic correspondence. Requests were made with the assumption they'd be fulfilled. Gifts were sent with expectation of reciprocity. The language implied a world where relationships were stable and obligations would be honored, because they always had been. But by the mid-13th century, roughly 1250 to 1220 BC, subtle changes begin appearing in the written record. Requests became more specific, more detailed about quantities and timing. Where earlier letters might ask generally for tin or grain, later ones specified exact amounts needed and when they were needed by. This might seem like just increased precision, but it suggests narrowing margins. When you have comfortable surplus, you don't need to be so exact. When margins are thin, Specificity matters because there's less room for shortfalls. Some letters began asking for things that had previously been assumed or had flowed automatically through established channels. Egyptian pharaohs requesting grain from Levantine vassals where those shipments had previously been routine. Hittite officials writing about the need for grain shipments in language that suggests urgency rather than routine administration. These weren't necessarily crisis declarations, but they revealed that what had been predictable was becoming less so. The Ugaritic texts from the final years before that city's destruction, around 1185 BC, are particularly revealing. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, was a major trading center with extensive connections throughout the Mediterranean. Its archives contain letters that show increasing concern about grain supplies, about the movement of people in troubling patterns, about threats to shipping and coastal settlements. The king of Ugarit writes to the king of Al-Ashia, which is Cyprus, around 1190 BC about enemy ships appearing along the coast, requesting military assistance while also noting grain shortages. One famous letter, found at Ugarit but written by an official from another city, contains the plaintive line, "Now the ships of the enemy have come. They have burned my cities with fire and have done wicked things to the land." This isn't administrative routine. This is someone writing in the midst of crisis, trying to explain why they can't fulfill previous obligations, why the normal patterns at exchange have broken down. But even this letter maintains certain formal courtesies, suggests that relationships can be maintained, that this is a temporary disruption rather than complete breakdown. That's telling. People continued to frame problems within the language of the existing system, even as that system was ceasing to function. They didn't have alternative vocabularies for describing what was happening, because nothing quite like it had happened within living memory. Correspondence from this period occasionally adopted more guarded, defensive language. Promises were reiterated in ways that suggest they'd been questioned. Explanations accompanied delays in what seems like preemptive justification. The expectation that obligations would be met remained. People still believed the system should work, but it was now supported by argument and reassurance rather than simply taken for granted. Appeals moved outward along established networks with increasing frequency. Cities wrote to allies for grain with language, suggesting this wasn't routine redistribution, but emergency response. Officials requested ships not just for cargo, but for protection of that cargo, indicating that safe passage could no longer be assumed. Courts sought confirmation that previous arrangements would continue, wanting explicit reassurance rather than relying on habit and precedent. When responses were delayed or incomplete, which happened with increasing frequency, local adjustments followed. Rations were modified, sometimes reduced. Work schedules shifted to adapt to whatever materials were actually available rather than what had been expected. Substitutions were made where possible. Someone needing bronze might make do with copper if that's what was available, accepting lower quality rather than waiting for proper materials that might not arrive. These adjustments were practical and limited. They didn't signal panic or announce collapse. They reflected experienced administrators doing what they'd always done, managing temporary disruptions, making the best of difficult situations, trusting that conditions would improve. Past experience suggested that coordination, once disrupted, would eventually reassert itself. There was no reason yet to think this time would be fundamentally different. In some regions, defensive concerns entered administrative records in ways they hadn't before. References to fortifications being strengthened or expanded appear at multiple sites dating to the later 13th century BC. Mycenaean citadels added or improved defensive walls during this period. Fortifications were built or upgraded at sites across the Levant. This wasn't universal. Some places show no such activity. But the pattern suggests widespread concern about security even before major disruptions occurred. These fortifications represent substantial investments of labor and resources. Building or extending massive stone walls required organization, feeding work crews for extended periods, providing materials and expertise. You don't undertake such projects casually. Their construction indicates that authorities in multiple regions independently decided that enhanced defenses were worth the cost, suggesting shared perceptions of increased risk, even if we can't always identify what specific threats they were responding to. The movement of goods began to show irregularities that left traces in the archaeological record. Storage jars at some sites show evidence of being filled, partially emptied, then sealed and stored, rather than being emptied completely and immediately reused, as had been standard practice. This suggests disrupted consumption patterns, goods arriving irregularly, being hoarded against uncertainty, not flowing smoothly through the system as they once had. At several sites, there's evidence of increasing reliance on locally made pottery and declining imports during the later 13th century BC. This isn't necessarily because quality local pottery wasn't available earlier. It's because the trade networks that had made exotic pottery available and affordable were becoming less reliable. When long-distance exchange becomes difficult or expensive, people substitute with local products. The archaeological shift toward local manufacture suggests contraction of trade networks even before dramatic collapse. For ordinary people, these changes appeared as alterations in routine rather than obvious crises. Deliveries might arrive later than expected. The specific goods anticipated might be substituted with alternatives. Instructions might change with less advance notice than had been typical. Work assignments could be modified to adapt to what materials were actually available. None of this required explanation because people were accustomed to dealing with temporary disruptions. What was different was the frequency and persistence of these small irregularities. One delayed shipment is normal variation. Many delayed shipments over an extended period suggests something more systematic is changing. But from within the process, this distinction isn't necessarily obvious. Each individual disruption can be explained as temporary. It's only in aggregate, looking back, that the pattern becomes clear. The texts from Pylos in Greece, dating to the final years before that palace's destruction around 1180 BC, show administrative responses to what seems to be military threat. Tablets record the deployment of rowers to coastal watching stations, suggesting concern about seaborne attack. Other tablets document bronze being gathered from various religious sanctuaries and redistributed, possibly for weapons production. These are extraordinary measures appearing in what otherwise looks like routine administrative documentation. What makes these tablets particularly poignant is that they're clearly working documents from an ongoing administrative process that was interrupted. Some tablets were never finished. Others contain erasures and corrections suggesting they were drafts. They capture a system still functioning, still attempting to manage problems through its established procedures, even as something larger was overwhelming it. Climate data from this period, derived from tree rings, ice cores, and sediment analysis, shows disruptions in the eastern Mediterranean region during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. There's evidence of drought conditions in Anatolia and the Levant. Pollen records suggest reduced agricultural activity in some regions. This doesn't necessarily mean catastrophic climate change, but it does indicate conditions that would have stressed agricultural systems that were already tightly calibrated with little margin for poor harvests. A series of poor harvests, even if not individually catastrophic, would have strained the networks that had evolved to redistribute surplus. When everyone needs grain simultaneously because everyone's harvest is poor, the system that depends on some regions having surplus to share breaks down. Egypt, with its Nile-fed agriculture less dependent on rainfall, became even more critical to regional grain supply. But there are limits to how much even Egyptian surplus could compensate for widespread poor harvests elsewhere. There's also evidence of increasing population movement during this period, though the details are often unclear from archaeology alone. Settlements appear and disappear in patterns that suggest people relocating, sometimes over considerable distances. This movement could have multiple causes: environmental stress, economic disruption, political instability, or people simply seeking opportunity elsewhere. Whatever the causes, large-scale population movement created stress on receiving regions and reduced stability in regions people were leaving. The Egyptian records from the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah, ruling from approximately 1213 to 1203 BC, describe conflicts with Libyan tribes and associated sea peoples during year 5 of his reign, around 1208 BC. These groups are described as coming from the sea and attempting to settle in the Nile Delta. Egypt defeated them militarily, but the fact that such large-scale movements were occurring suggests broader disruptions affecting regions beyond Egypt itself. Later, during the reign of Ramses III, ruling approximately 1186 to 1155 BC, the famous Medinet Habu inscriptions describe extensive conflicts with groups identified as sea peoples, attempting to invade Egypt both by sea and by land, around 1177 BC. These inscriptions describe the destruction of other kingdoms: Hatti, the Hittites, Arzawa, Alashia, Cyprus, and others, suggesting that by the time these groups reached Egypt, much of the eastern Mediterranean had already been severely disrupted. But we should be careful about how we interpret these sea peoples references. The Egyptian texts use this as a catch-all term for multiple different groups arriving from different directions, possibly at different times. Some may have been raiders. Others may have been refugees displaced by disruptions elsewhere, moving in large groups that included families and possessions, seeking new places to settle because their original homes had become unlivable for various reasons. The traditional narrative has often presented the sea peoples as external invaders who destroyed Bronze Age civilization. But increasingly, scholarship views them as part of a more complex process, where multiple stresses created cascading failures. Some groups identified as sea peoples may have originated from within the Bronze Age world itself, displaced by climate stress, economic collapse, or political fragmentation, then appearing elsewhere as apparently foreign raiders or settlers. What becomes clear from looking at evidence across multiple sites and regions is that problems weren't uniform or simultaneous. Different areas experienced disruption at different times and in different ways. Some regions show evidence of crisis in the mid-13th century BC. Others remained relatively stable into the early 12th century BC. Some sites were destroyed violently. Others were simply abandoned without clear evidence of conflict. Some show signs of gradual decline. Others seem to have collapsed quite rapidly. This patchwork pattern is actually more consistent with a systemic breakdown than with a single external threat. If a unified invasion force had swept through the region, you'd expect more uniform timing and similar patterns of destruction. Instead, what we see is more like a network beginning to fail at multiple points, with cascading effects as each failure put additional stress on remaining connections. Trade routes that depended on multiple stable nodes along their length would have become unusable if any critical node failed. A merchant facing disrupted routes might try alternatives, but if those were also becoming unreliable, the entire basis for long-distance trade eroded. Workshops dependent on distant tin couldn't simply switch to local sources that didn't exist. Palaces that had reduced local grain storage in favor of regional redistribution faced immediate crisis when that redistribution failed. The confidence that had built up through generations of success became a vulnerability when conditions changed. The system had optimized for normal operation at the expense of resilience in abnormal conditions. When multiple things went wrong simultaneously, climate stress reducing harvests, population movements creating instability, trade disruptions cutting off essential materials, possibly disease outbreaks. Though these are hard to detect archaeologically, the system proved less able to adapt than it would have needed to be to survive. Throughout this period of increasing stress, from roughly 1250 to 1200 BC, people continued to work within the existing framework. Officials still wrote letters using established formats. Scribes still created administrative tablets following standard conventions. Palace workshops still attempted to maintain production. The forms of the system persisted even as its functionality declined. This is psychologically understandable. When you've lived your entire life within a particular system, when that system has worked for your parents and grandparents before you, it's difficult to imagine it simply ceasing to function. You assume that whatever problems exist can be solved using established methods, because that's what's always worked before. You keep trying to make the system work because you have no alternative framework for organizing society at that scale. But there's a threshold where accumulated stress overwhelms adaptive capacity, where the problems requiring solution exceed the resources available to solve them, where the delays in coordination become longer than the time available before consequences become irreversible. The Bronze Age world was approaching that threshold in the decades around 1200 BC, though very few people living through it could have recognized this at the time. The signs of stress were there, visible in retrospect, embedded in administrative records and archaeological evidence. But they were interpretable as temporary difficulties to be managed rather than as symptoms of fundamental breakdown. The system that had worked for so long still seemed capable of absorbing these shocks as it had absorbed others before. That confidence would prove misplaced. But it was entirely reasonable given the historical experience available to people at the time. They had no precedent for what was about to happen. No living memory included anything like the comprehensive breakdown that was coming. They could only respond based on what they knew, using tools and systems that had always worked before. And for a while longer, those tools and systems continued to function, even as the ground beneath them was shifting in ways that would soon make their continued operation impossible. As pressures continued to accumulate through the later 13th century BC and into the early 12th century, around 1220 to 1180 BC, their effects became visible not just in administrative records, but in actual physical movement of people across the landscape. This wasn't organized migration in any coordinated sense. It was thousands of individual and household decisions, made for diverse reasons, that collectively reshaped the human geography of the Eastern Mediterranean. People began leaving places that had sustained them, not necessarily because those places had become completely uninhabitable, but because conditions had deteriorated enough to make the risks of moving seem preferable to the certainty of staying. Fields that no longer yielded adequate harvests were abandoned, at least temporarily. Workshops without steady material supplies closed or relocated to places where supplies seemed more reliable. Coastal settlements facing increased insecurity moved inland or consolidated into more defensible positions. This movement was uneven in timing and scale. Some regions saw substantial population shifts while nearby areas remained relatively stable. The movement wasn't necessarily permanent. Families might relocate for a season, hoping conditions would improve enough to allow return. Craftsmen sought work where materials and markets still existed, intending to return home once normal patterns resumed. Most people didn't travel enormous distances. They moved along familiar paths, toward places they already knew or had heard about through existing connections. The displacement followed the contours of the Bronze Age network, even as that network strained and fractured. People didn't scatter randomly. They moved along established routes toward known destinations, using the same paths that trade goods had traveled, stopping at familiar way stations. This meant that movement concentrated along certain routes and toward certain destinations, creating pressure points where receiving regions struggled to absorb newcomers, while origin regions lost the labor and skills those people had provided. Coastal areas experienced these changes earlier and more intensely than inland regions in many cases. Harbors that had welcomed regular maritime traffic began facing longer gaps between ship arrivals. The rhythm of seasonal trade that had structured life in port cities became disrupted and unpredictable. Ships appeared less regularly, sometimes traveling in groups rather than individually, suggesting that collective movement provided security that individual voyages no longer had. These changes didn't require identified enemies to create them. Insecurity emerged from uncertainty rather than from specific, named threats. A delayed ship meant more than simple inconvenience. It meant uncertainty about whether goods expected for workshop production or palace distribution would arrive at all. Rumors of trouble along usual routes might redirect maritime traffic for weeks or months, creating irregular patterns that made planning difficult. Coastal settlements couldn't know whether that sail appearing on the horizon belonged to expected traders or to raiders or to displaced people seeking landing with unknown intentions. Decisions were made locally based on incomplete information, and their effects rippled through connected regions in ways that were hard to predict. A port that closed to external ships for security reasons immediately affected trade routes that had depended on it as a node. Merchants who'd planned on stopping there had to find alternatives, lengthening voyages, increasing costs, sometimes making planned exchanges impossible. The closure protected local interests but contributed to broader network disruption. As people moved, they carried skills and knowledge with them. Potters, metalworkers, weavers, scribes, specialists whose expertise had been cultivated over years of training, found themselves working in new contexts. Sometimes they integrated into existing communities, their skills welcome even if their presence created social complexities. Other times they competed for limited resources with local craftspeople, creating tensions that might not have existed before. Their arrival altered local balances in subtle ways that accumulated over time. A community that had supported 2 potters might now have 4, dividing the market, reducing everyone's income, creating pressure that hadn't existed before. Regions that had been exporters of certain goods might find themselves competing with displaced craftspeople who brought their skills from elsewhere. These weren't dramatic changes individually, but collectively, they shifted economic relationships in ways that created new instabilities. Inland routes were affected as well, though often differently than coastal connections. Caravans adjusted schedules or changed paths to avoid regions that had become uncertain. The calculations that had made particular routes attractive, reliable water sources, established rest stops, relationships with local authorities, no longer held uniformly. Exchanges that had been routine became conditional, dependent on current circumstances rather than long-standing relationships. Trust, built over generations of reliable interaction, required constant reinforcement once it could no longer be assumed. Merchants who dealt with each other for years might now require additional assurances or guarantees. Credit relationships that had been informal became formalized or ceased entirely. The social capital that had lubricated trade through personal connections depreciated as relationships became more transactional and cautious. Where reassurance was absent, distance grew. Not physical distance, but social and economic distance. Partners who'd once coordinated closely began operating more independently, reluctant to commit resources to exchanges that might not be completed. This created a kind of economic contraction, where people pulled back to what they could directly control, reducing the extent of exchange even where exchange remained technically possible. The breakdown wasn't uniform geographically. Some regions remained more stable than others for reasons that varied: better agricultural conditions, stronger political authority, favorable strategic position, or sometimes just luck. Certain trade routes continued functioning, sustained by strong local relationships or by conditions that made them more resilient than alternatives. Egypt generally maintained greater stability than many other regions, partly because of the Nile's reliability for agriculture, partly because of its geographic advantages. But these differences created new imbalances. Regions still connected and functioning bore additional strain as they absorbed demand from places that had lost their connections. A palace that had provisioned its own territory might now face requests or demands from neighboring regions experiencing shortages. This stretched resources, created difficult political decisions about who to support and how much, sometimes generated conflicts where previously there had been cooperation. Administrative responses largely followed familiar patterns, because those were the only tools available. Officials recorded movements where they could, though their ability to track populations in motion was limited. They reassigned labor to adapt to changing availability. They attempted to re-establish interrupted routes through negotiation, sending messages to partners explaining problems and seeking to maintain relationships despite disruptions. These efforts assumed that disruptions were temporary, that the goal was to maintain connections through difficult times until normal patterns could resume. This was reasonable based on experience. Previous disruptions had been temporary. The systemic nature of current problems wasn't obvious from within them. Each individual problem seemed manageable, if only other problems would stop accumulating faster than solutions could be implemented. For ordinary people, the experience was immediate and practical rather than abstract. Work became harder to secure when workshops couldn't guarantee material supplies. Food supplies arrived less reliably when distribution networks functioned irregularly. Decisions about where to live, whom to trust, how to secure basic necessities carried greater weight and had less certain outcomes than they had previously. Movement wasn't dramatic in any individual instance. Families didn't flee as refugees in panic. They made careful calculations about alternatives, gathered what they could carry, traveled to places where they had connections or had heard conditions were better. Most journeys were modest in distance, to a neighboring region, to a city that seemed more stable, to territories where they had kinship connections that might provide initial support. But these modest movements accumulated into significant population shifts over time. A settlement that lost 5% of its population might not notice immediately, lose 5% every few years for 2 decades, and suddenly a third of the population is gone, taking with them labor, skills, and social connections. Meanwhile, regions receiving people face different pressures, providing for newcomers, integrating them socially, managing competition for resources between established residents and arrivals. What distinguished this period, roughly 1220 to 1180 BC, wasn't the scale of any single crisis, but the number of crises occurring simultaneously across multiple regions. Climate stress affected harvests in several areas at once. Trade disruptions cut multiple routes. Political instabilities appeared in various kingdoms. Population movements created pressures in both origin and destination regions. None of these problems alone would necessarily have overwhelmed the Bronze Age system. Together, they created demands that exceeded the system's capacity to respond. The network that had bound the Bronze Age world together depended on most connections working most of the time. It had never needed every connection to function perfectly. There had always been redundancy, alternative routes, backup arrangements. But as more connections failed, the remaining ones carried increased load while the alternatives diminished. Eventually, critical thresholds were crossed where systems that had been resilient became fragile, where small additional problems could trigger disproportionate consequences. Trust between regions eroded as reliability declined. Agreements that had relied on expectation and habit now required explicit guarantees or enforcement mechanisms. Where neither was available, cooperation slowed or ceased. The network remained visible. The roots still existed. The historical relationships were remembered. But its functionality diminished as transactions that had been routine became difficult or impossible. Movement continued because staying still was no longer viable everywhere. People adapted as they'd always done, but with fewer assurances that adaptation would be sufficient. The world they inhabited was recognizable but altered. Familiar paths led to less certain destinations. Known relationships functioned less predictably. The social and economic landscape was shifting in ways that made older certainties obsolete without yet replacing them with new, stable patterns. This wasn't collapse in any sudden sense. It was transformation through accumulation of changes that individually seemed manageable but collectively exceeded the system's adaptive capacity. People continued to live, work, make decisions, respond to circumstances. But the framework within which they operated was dissolving even as they tried to maintain it. By around 1200 BC, 1200 years before Christ, and 3200 years before our present, the Bronze Age world had entered a period of profound instability from which it wouldn't recover in anything like its previous form. The movements of people, the disruptions of trade, the strains on political authority, all of these would continue and intensify over the following decades, producing outcomes that would have been almost unimaginable to someone living in 1300 BC. The world bound by bronze was coming unbound, not through any single catastrophe, but through a systemic breakdown where multiple interconnected problems reinforced each other, where solutions that had always worked before proved insufficient, where the complexity that had enabled prosperity became a source of vulnerability that people couldn't navigate successfully. And yet, even in the midst of this disruption, life continued. People still farmed land that would grow crops. Craftspeople still practiced skills learned over years. Communities still gathered for festivals and maintained relationships with their gods. The breakdown of large-scale systems didn't mean the end of human activity or meaning. It meant the end of a particular way of organizing that activity across distance and time. What came next would be different, smaller in scale, less connected, more local, but still human, still adaptive, still capable of creating meaning and sustaining life. The ending of one world would create space for the beginning of others. What held the Bronze Age world together wasn't any single element that could be identified and isolated. It was timing, alignment, and the coordination of multiple processes that had to work simultaneously. Goods needed to arrive when they were expected, not weeks or months late. Messages needed to reach their destinations before the decisions they informed became irrelevant. Specialists needed materials that appeared with enough regularity to sustain continuous work. When this careful timing faltered across multiple points at once during the decades around 1200 to 1150 BC, the system didn't shatter in a single dramatic moment. It thinned, gradually losing the capacity to function until what remained was recognizably broken. Trade was among the first casualties, visible in the archaeological record through the disappearance of imported goods at sites across the eastern Mediterranean. Shipments that had grown irregular through the later 13th century BC now failed to arrive at all. Routes that had been kept open through habit, through relationships maintained across generations, were abandoned when the risks outweighed any remaining familiarity. Ports waited without clear information about whether delays signaled temporary disruption or permanent loss of connection. The sea continued to move, of course. Water still connected shores. But the patterns that had organized maritime trade dissolved. A merchant contemplating a voyage faced calculations very different from those that had prevailed a generation earlier. The expected harbors might not welcome his ship. The goods he carried might find no buyers. The return cargo he'd planned on might not be available. The relationships that had made trade work, the credit, the trust, the mutual obligations, were breaking down faster than they could be replaced. Without regular exchange, administrative routines that had structured Bronze Age palace economies struggled to function in their accustomed ways. Storerooms that had been managed through careful calculation of inflows and outflows now recorded shortages that couldn't be resolved by redistribution, because the network that had enabled redistribution no longer worked reliably. Requests for materials went unanswered, not because they were refused, but because no response could be organized in time to matter. Officials continued to write. This is visible in the latest tablets from sites like Pylos and Ugarit, but their messages accumulated without producing the effects they were intended to create. The act of record-keeping persisted briefly even as the conditions those records documented slipped beyond administrative control. There's something poignant about these final tablets. They show a system still trying to function according to its established procedures, even as it was being overwhelmed by circumstances those procedures couldn't accommodate. Then, gradually and unevenly across different sites and regions, the writing stopped. Archives that had grown continuously for centuries, accumulating thousands of tablets recording the daily business of palace administration, fell silent. At some sites like Pylos, around 1180 BC, this happened abruptly, the archive ending mid-process with incomplete tablets, suggesting the work was interrupted suddenly. At other sites, writing faded more gradually, with simpler or shorter texts appearing after long gaps, particular categories of documents disappearing before others. Literacy didn't vanish everywhere simultaneously or completely. Egypt maintained its writing systems, though with reduced output during troubled periods. Some Levantine cities continued to use alphabetic scripts, but the palace-centered administrative literacy that had produced tens of thousands of tablets across Mycenaean Greece, Crete, and other regions simply ceased. The scribal schools that had trained new generations of record keepers closed. The economic basis for supporting literacy specialists disappeared when palace systems collapsed. This loss of writing represents more than just the disappearance of a technology. It meant the loss of the administrative apparatus that writing had made possible. The ability to track complex exchanges across distance and time, to maintain records that allowed planning beyond immediate circumstances, to coordinate activities that no individual could hold entirely in memory. Without writing, certain kinds of complexity became impossible to sustain. The social and economic landscape contracted to what could be managed through memory, direct observation, and personal relationships. Workshops reflected this transformation in material form, visible in archaeological excavations. At sites across the affected regions, workshop areas show evidence of interrupted activity dating to the early 12th century BC. Bronze working tools lay abandoned mid-use. Molds cooled without being reused for subsequent castings. Kilns went cold between firings and weren't relit. Raw materials remained stored but unused. These spaces weren't destroyed in dramatic fashion in most cases. They were simply left behind when work could no longer continue as expected. The pattern suggests abandonment rather than destruction at many sites, though some certainly show evidence of violent destruction. People left these places when they recognized that whatever disruption they were experiencing wouldn't be temporary, that the conditions necessary for continuing their work weren't going to return soon enough to matter. A bronze smith without tin couldn't simply wait a few weeks for the next shipment. When weeks became months and months extended toward years with no reliable supply, at some point continuing to wait became irrational. The loss of coordination preceded political collapse in most regions. Authority weakened as the ability to communicate and enforce decisions over distance failed. Instructions couldn't reach their destinations or arrived too late to be implemented. Resources couldn't be mobilized quickly enough to respond to crises. Local officials made decisions within increasingly narrow horizons, responding to immediate pressures rather than attempting to maintain inherited obligations that no longer seemed relevant or achievable. This shift didn't announce itself as rebellion or as conscious reform. It emerged through necessity, through the practical impossibility of maintaining systems that required coordination when coordination was no longer achievable. A local leader who couldn't get instructions from higher authority, who couldn't send messages that would be received, who faced immediate threats or needs that couldn't wait for distant decisions, simply acted independently because waiting meant failing to act at all. Different regions experienced this process at different times and in different ways, creating a complex geographical and chronological pattern that archaeology has spent decades trying to untangle. Some centers endured longer than others, sustained by residual connections, stored surplus, or local conditions that provided temporary resilience. The Hittite capital of Hattusa in central Anatolia seems to have been abandoned around 1190 BC, its massive fortifications and palace complex left empty. Mycenaean palaces across Greece burned or were abandoned in a period spanning roughly 1200 to 1150 BC. though the exact timing varied by site. Ugarit on the Syrian coast was destroyed around 1185 BC and never reoccupied as a major center. Troy on the Anatolian coast shows evidence of destruction around 1180 BC. Hazor in the Levant burned around 1200 BC. But other sites like Athens continued through this period with less dramatic disruption. Certain Cypriot cities adapted rather than collapsing entirely. The pattern isn't uniform, suggesting that local circumstances mattered enormously in determining specific outcomes. Some inland areas disconnected from maritime routes adjusted differently from coastal settlements that had been directly exposed to whatever disruptions affected sea travel. Mountain communities that had never been deeply integrated into palace systems might have experienced the late Bronze Age collapse, primarily as the disappearance of distant markets for whatever goods they'd traded and the unavailability of imports they'd become accustomed to, but without the catastrophic disruption of their basic subsistence. The Bronze Age world didn't fall as a single structure because it never was a single structure. It was a network of relationships, a web of connections that had created interdependence without creating unified political authority. When that network broke apart, it did so along the lines that had connected it. Trade routes that had bound regions together became the pathways along which disruption traveled. Dependence that had provided resilience through redistribution became vulnerability when redistribution failed. Violence certainly occurred during this period. Destruction layers at archaeological sites, Egyptian records of battles, weapons found in contexts suggesting conflict. But violence doesn't fully explain the pattern of collapse. Some sites show no evidence of violent destruction but were abandoned anyway. Some show destruction but also evidence of rebuilding and continued occupation. Violence was part of the story, but probably more as a consequence and accelerator of breakdown than as its fundamental cause. What mattered more was the inability to rebuild what had been lost, to restore connections once they broke, to restart coordination once it had ceased. When a palace burned, whether from raid or accident or internal conflict, the question wasn't just whether it could be physically rebuilt. It was whether the economic and social basis for palace-centered administration still existed. Could it still gather the resources that would have been needed to restore it? Did the network of connections it had coordinated still function? In most cases, the answer was no. The conditions that had sustained Bronze Age palaces, regular tribute from agriculture, access to trade goods, including essential metals, specialist labor supported by redistributive economies, writing systems for coordination, were themselves products of the system that was collapsing. When the system broke down, it took away the preconditions for its own restoration. As institutions failed, everyday life contracted for most people. Communities relied on what remained immediately accessible. Long-distance coordination disappeared from daily experience. Skills tied to administrative systems lost their purpose and their support. Knowledge persisted unevenly, embedded in practice rather than in written records that could be consulted by future generations. The sound of the Bronze Age world changed fundamentally. Where once there had been constant movement, goods being counted, messages delivered, tools repaired, ships arriving at harbors, caravans stopping at way stations, there was increasing quiet. Not sudden silence, but thinning noise. Fewer footsteps in palace corridors. Fewer marks being impressed into clay tablets. Fewer ships expected at harbor mouths. Fewer transactions requiring the weighing of goods against standard measures. This quiet didn't signal the end of all human activity. People continued to live, work, and adapt. What ended was a particular way of organizing life across distance, a system of coordination that had allowed Bronze Age societies to operate at scales and levels of complexity that had been unprecedented in human history. The structures that had once aligned regions no longer produced predictable outcomes. Attempts to restore them faltered without the coordination infrastructure that had made them possible. The collapse of the Bronze Age world was therefore not a moment, but an interval, a period extending across decades and affecting different places at different times. Some communities preserved fragments of earlier organization. Writing systems survived in modified forms in some regions. Craft traditions continued with altered practices. Social hierarchies persisted in reduced forms. But the integrated system that had characterized the Late Bronze Age dissolved into smaller, more local arrangements that couldn't sustain the same level of complexity. What binds these diverse experiences together is absence. The absence of written records where they once accumulated annually. The absence of imported goods where they had been routine. The absence of administrative coordination where it had structured production and distribution. The absence of expectation that tomorrow would follow yesterday in familiar patterns. These absences are what remain most visible in the archaeological record, traced through abandoned palace complexes, through layers of ash and destruction, through the disappearance of distinctive pottery styles and craft traditions, through gaps in settlement patterns. The system didn't end because it had been poorly designed or because the people operating it were incompetent. It ended because the conditions that sustained its complexity no longer aligned. Multiple stresses accumulated faster than responses could address them. Margins that had been adequate proved insufficient when multiple problems arrived simultaneously. The resilience that had been proven across generations of normal variation wasn't sufficient for the scale of disruption that occurred around 1200 BC. What followed was not immediate replacement with a new system of equal complexity, but a period of adjustment shaped by loss. Loss of scale, loss of connection, loss of institutional memory. Life continued within narrower bounds for most people, focused on immediate communities and local relationships rather than on distant exchanges and palace coordination. That continuation mattered enormously to the people living through it, even if it represented profound change from what had existed before. The Bronze Age world passed not because it was inevitable that it would, but because specific conditions intersected in ways that proved overwhelming. That contingency is important. The system had worked for centuries. It might have continued working under different circumstances. That it failed doesn't mean it was doomed to fail, only that it did fail when faced with stresses that exceeded its adaptive capacity. And in that failure, in the ruins of what had been built so carefully over generations, the seeds of whatever would come next began to take root, slowly and unevenly, as people adapted to new realities and found ways to continue living in a world that had been fundamentally transformed. When the larger systems ceased to function, when palace administration collapsed, when long-distance trade became unreliable or impossible, when writing disappeared from most regions, life didn't stop. It contracted. What remained was closer, smaller, more immediate. Communities adjusted by relying on what lay within direct reach rather than on what could no longer be expected to arrive from distant sources. Farming continued, though often on reduced scale and altered patterns. The archaeological record from the 12th and 11th centuries BC, roughly 1150 to 1000 BC, shows changes in agricultural settlement patterns across many regions. Some areas were abandoned entirely, while others saw new small settlements appear. Fields that had once produced surplus for palatial redistribution were now worked primarily to sustain individual households and immediate neighbors. The organization of agriculture became more local, less tied to institutional demands for specific crops or regular surplus. Knowledge of soil, seasons, and weather persisted because it was embedded in practice, passed directly from farmers to their children and neighbors. This knowledge didn't require writing to be transmitted. You learned when to plant by watching when your neighbors planted and remembering what worked in previous years. You learned which fields were most productive through direct experience. Crop rotation, irrigation when possible, storage techniques, all of this continued through demonstration and practice. The rhythms of planting and harvest still structured the year because those rhythms were imposed by nature, rather than by institutional calendars. But the connection between agricultural production and larger social systems had been severed. Farmers no longer delivered portions of their harvest to palace storerooms for redistribution. They kept what they grew or exchanged it locally for other goods and services. This probably meant reduced total productivity in many areas. Without institutional organization, large-scale irrigation or land improvement projects became impossible. But it also meant farming continued. Elites disappeared from the archaeological record more quickly than farmers. The markers of high status, Bronze Age life elaborate burials, rich grave goods, imported luxury items, monumental architecture, largely vanished during the 12th century BC. This doesn't necessarily mean the individuals who had held elite positions all died suddenly. More likely, the basis for their elite status dissolved. Without palace systems to administer, without long-distance trade to control, without redistributive economies to manage, the roles that had created and sustained Bronze Age elites ceased to exist. Some local leaders undoubtedly continued to hold authority, but on different bases, personal qualities rather than institutional position, control of land rather than control of trade, skill in conflict rather than skill in administration. The criteria for leadership changed when the context for leadership changed. What had worked in organized palace-centered societies didn't necessarily work in more fragmented, localized conditions. Administrative roles lost their function entirely without records to manage, without redistributive systems to coordinate, without long-distance relationships to maintain. The specialists in record-keeping, the scribes whose training had taken years to complete, found their skills suddenly useless. Some may have adapted to other roles. Others probably couldn't adapt, their expertise too specific to transfer. The institution of specialized scribal literacy simply disappeared in most affected regions, not to return for centuries. Authority narrowed to local figures whose influence depended on proximity and personal relationships, rather than on position within larger institutional hierarchies. A leader who could organize defense of a specific settlement, who could mediate disputes within a community, who could coordinate local responses to immediate problems. That kind of authority remained relevant. But the complex administrative apparatus that had characterized Bronze Age palace systems vanished because the scale and coordination it had managed were no longer achievable. The loss of long-distance connection brought with it a loss of shared memory that extended beyond immediate regions. Places that had once been linked through trade and diplomatic correspondence now existed in relative isolation, separated by routes that were no longer traveled regularly. Knowledge of distant regions faded within a generation or two. Without trade contact, without travelers bringing news, without written records documenting relationships, the broader world simply disappeared from most people's awareness. Stories of distant places might persist for a while, becoming vaguer and more mythical with each retelling. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age, Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, Ugarit, became memories, then legends, then eventually were forgotten entirely in most regions. Only in places where some continuity was maintained, like Egypt, did detailed memory of the Bronze Age world survive. And even there it became increasingly distorted over time. Ruins remained as lasting physical evidence of what had been, though their meaning became obscure surprisingly quickly. Large structures built for palace administration stood empty or partially collapsed. Massive fortification walls surrounded spaces no longer used. Stone buildings, whose original purposes had been specific to Bronze Age administrative needs, became incomprehensible to later inhabitants who had no framework for understanding them. These ruins were reused pragmatically rather than historically. Stones were taken for new construction projects when people needed building materials. Walls became boundaries for fields or enclosures for animals. Spaces within abandoned palaces might house small communities that used the structures without understanding or caring what they'd originally been for. The past was present, as material resources rather than as meaningful history. This reuse actually obscures the archaeological record in complicated ways. When later people built on top of or into earlier structures, they disrupted the layers archaeologists used to interpret the past. They moved materials around, dug through earlier deposits, left their own debris mixed with earlier remains. This makes reconstruction of the transition period between the Bronze Age and what followed particularly difficult. We know massive change occurred, but the details are often murky. Material culture simplified dramatically during this period. Archaeological excavations show that the range of artifact types present at sites from the 11th and 10th centuries BC is much reduced compared to the Late Bronze Age. Pottery became more locally made, less standardized across regions, simpler in decoration and form. This reflects loss of specialist production, loss of trade that had distributed distinctive styles, and adaptation to circumstances where people made do with what could be produced locally. Metal objects became scarce. Bronze continued to be used where possible, but the tin needed to make bronze properly was simply unavailable in most regions once long-distance trade collapsed. Copper tools appear in reduced numbers. Iron begins to appear with increasing frequency, not because iron technology suddenly became available. Ironworking had existed in limited form during the Late Bronze Age, but because iron ore was more widely available locally than tin was. When you can't get tin to make bronze, iron becomes attractive, despite being initially inferior in many applications. The transition to iron as the primary metal wasn't revolutionary in any technological sense. It was adaptive, a response to the unavailability of bronze due to collapsed trade networks. Iron tools were probably inferior to bronze tools for most purposes during this early period, but a mediocre iron tool you could actually obtain was preferable to an excellent bronze tool you couldn't access. Adaptation to new materials wasn't a sign of progress. It was evidence of loss of access to preferred materials. Craft traditions continued, but with narrower range and reduced standardization. Potters still made vessels, but with more local variation in style and less evidence of specialist production for export. Weavers still produced cloth, but probably with simpler patterns and more focus on immediate local needs rather than producing for trade. The skills themselves persisted because they remained useful, and because they could be transmitted directly through apprenticeship and demonstration without requiring institutional support. What survived was what could be maintained without large-scale coordination, without distant inputs, without written records. Knowledge became more practical and more regional. How to farm this particular soil in this particular climate. How to make pots from this particular clay using this particular firing technique. How to work metals that were locally available. The universal standards and shared practices that had characterized the Bronze Age craft production dissolved into local variations. This wasn't a complete return to some earlier state, despite sometimes being described that way. The people living in the 11th and 10th centuries BC weren't the same as people living in the early Bronze Age before palace systems developed. They carried memories, however distorted, of the more complex world that had existed. They reused materials and spaces from that world. They lived in a landscape shaped by Bronze Age activity even when they didn't understand that shaping. But neither was this simply continuity. The loss of complexity was real and profound. Things that had been possible in 1300 BC were no longer possible in 1100 BC. Scales of organization that had been achieved couldn't be replicated. Knowledge that had existed was lost. The social and economic landscape had contracted in ways that limited what could be accomplished collectively. Trade continued to exist, but at much reduced scale and with different character. Local and regional exchange certainly persisted. People still needed goods, they couldn't produce themselves. But the long-distance, institutionally organized, carefully recorded trade of the Bronze Age had ceased. What remained was more informal, more personal, more limited in volume and in the distances goods traveled. Some regions maintained more continuity than others. Cyprus seems to have experienced less catastrophic disruption than many areas, with some Bronze Age traditions continuing in modified form. Certain Phoenician cities on the Levantine coast adapted successfully to new conditions, eventually developing maritime trade networks that would become important in later centuries. Egypt experienced political fragmentation and reduced power, but maintained more institutional continuity than most other Bronze Age kingdoms. These variations meant that the post-collapse landscape was diverse. Some areas fell to very low levels of organization and population. Others maintained more complex arrangements. Some saw new peoples arriving and settling. Others experienced primarily population decline among existing residents. There's no single pattern that applies uniformly across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. What was universal was the loss of the integrated system that had characterized the late Bronze Age. Even in regions that maintained some continuity, they no longer participated in the broad network of exchange and communication that had bound the Bronze Age world together. They operated within smaller horizons, connected to fewer distant places, managing their affairs with less coordination beyond immediate regions. The cultural memory of this transition is interesting to trace in later traditions. Greek mythology preserves stories about earlier ages of heroes and great kings, traditions that may reflect actual Bronze Age societies viewed through the distorting lens of centuries of oral transmission. The Trojan War story, whatever historical events it might be based on, was set in this transitional period by later Greeks who saw it as marking the end of an age of heroes. Homer's epics, composed centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, describe a world that combines authentic Bronze Age details, the catalogue of ships, certain objects and practices, with elements from later periods and with imaginative additions. The poems aren't historical documents, but they suggest that memory of a different, greater past persisted long enough to be woven into cultural tradition, even if the details became increasingly mythologized. Similarly, later Egyptian texts sometimes refer back to earlier periods of greater power and extent, though with chronologies that are often confused and details that mix memory with imagination. The biblical tradition preserves stories of exodus and conquest, set roughly in this transitional period, though scholars debate endlessly about what historical events, if any, these narratives might reflect. What's clear is that later peoples recognized that an earlier, different world had existed, even when their knowledge of it was fragmentary and mythologized. The period from roughly 1150 to 1000 BC, sometimes called the Greek Dark Age, or more broadly the Late Bronze Age collapse period, was characterized by reduced population in many areas, loss of literacy in most regions, reduced trade, simpler material culture, and more localized political organization. But Dark Age is a problematic term because it reflects what we don't know. The absence of written records from most regions makes this period harder to study, rather than necessarily meaning it was dark for people living through it. People still lived. Communities still functioned. Culture and meaning persisted even if they took different forms. The reduction in scale and complexity that archaeologists observe was probably experienced by contemporaries more as adaptation to new circumstances than as catastrophic loss. For someone born in 1100 BC, the Bronze Age palace world was ancient history, something their grandparents might have vague memories of, but which had no direct relevance to current life. This was their normal. Fields to farm, which they did, communities to live in, which they maintained, gods to worship, which they honored through practices that evolved to fit new circumstances, stories to tell, which became the myths and legends that would be passed down. They weren't living in a dark age from their own perspective. They were living in the world as it was, adapting as humans have always adapted, finding meaning and creating culture within whatever circumstances they faced. The archaeological silence, the absence of texts, the reduced material culture, the simpler settlement patterns, shouldn't be mistaken for absence of life or absence of meaning. It represents change in what leaves traces that survive for archaeologists to find. Oral traditions don't fossilize. Wooden buildings decay. Simple pottery is harder to date precisely. Social structures that don't build monumental architecture leave less visible evidence. But life continued, generation after generation, within horizons that had narrowed but not disappeared. The world had changed profoundly, but human capacity to adapt, to find ways of living within altered circumstances, to create meaning and maintain community, all of that persisted. The Bronze Age world had ended, but human worlds continued, smaller and more local, yes, but still capable of sustaining the activities and relationships that make human life possible and meaningful. Over the following centuries, from roughly 1000 to 750 BC, recovery was slow and uneven. Population gradually increased in many regions. Trade began to revive along new patterns. New forms of political organization emerged, quite different from Bronze Age palace systems. Writing was reinvented or reintroduced in various regions, usually in forms simpler than Bronze Age writing systems, like the alphabetic scripts that spread through the Levantine coast and eventually into Greece. The world that emerged from this recovery was not a restoration of what had been lost. It was something genuinely new, built on the ruins of the Bronze Age, but organized according to different principles, with different political structures, different economic patterns, different relationships between centers and peripheries. The city-states of archaic Greece, the Phoenician trading networks, the Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia, the eventually resurgent Egypt. All of these represented new formations rather than continuations of Bronze Age patterns. This new world would eventually achieve levels of complexity and scale comparable to or exceeding the Bronze Age, but organized differently. The palace-centered redistributive economies of the Bronze Age gave way to more diverse economic arrangements. The administrative literacy that had served palace bureaucracies gave way to alphabetic writing that was easier to learn and more widely accessible. The political geography shifted entirely, with new peoples, new kingdoms, new relationships replacing the late Bronze Age configuration. But that recovery took centuries. For the generations living through the 12th, 11th, and 10th centuries BC, the Bronze Age world was simply gone. What remained was a landscape shaped by its ruins, a memory preserved in distorted form through oral tradition, and the human capacity to continue living within whatever circumstances exist, finding ways to organize society, sustain communities, and create meaning at whatever scale proves possible. The quiet that settled over this post-collapse world was not emptiness. It was the sound of life at a different scale, organized around different principles, carrying on without the institutional complexity that had characterized the Bronze Age. People farmed. People made things. People told stories and raised children and maintained relationships with their gods and with each other. The specific forms all of this took had changed, but the fundamental human activities persisted. Time continued to pass after the collapse, but it left fewer marks that we can read now, thousands of years later. Generations were born and grew old without writing, shaping their world in most regions. The skills required to keep written records, to measure across distance, to speak in the language of administration, these no longer found use or support. In the territories that had been Mycenaean Greece, Linear B disappeared entirely, not to be recovered until modern archaeologists deciphered it in the 1950s. Clay tablets from the Bronze Age, when found, were initially incomprehensible because the script had been completely forgotten. Without writing, memory traveled by other means. Knowledge moved through stories, through gestures and demonstrations, through repeated practice. What was worth remembering was what could be carried without tools or formal training. Instructions for crafts were shown rather than written. Histories were shaped by oral retelling, adjusting to circumstance and audience over generations. Precision faded where it no longer served practical purpose. replaced by the kind of memory that oral cultures maintain. Memorable for different reasons, structured around rhythm and story rather than exact detail. This shift meant that certain kinds of knowledge were preserved while others were lost. A farmer could pass down detailed knowledge about local soils, about which fields drained well and which retained water, about which crops grew best where, because this knowledge was practiced annually and could be demonstrated directly. A weaver could teach patterns and techniques through hands-on instruction that required no writing. But the specific quantities recorded on Bronze Age tablets, the exact distances and measures, the precise relationships between distant places, all of this dissolved into vaguer understanding. Horizons narrowed for most people in the centuries after 1150 BC. Communities knew their immediate neighbors well, and distant places less so, or not at all. Routes that had once linked regions across hundreds of kilometers were remembered unevenly when they were remembered at all, sometimes as fragments of direction without clear destination. That way lies the sea, carried less specific meaning than that route leads to the harbor at Pylos, where ships from Cyprus arrive in spring. Names of places persisted sometimes without clear locations attached to them anymore. A community might preserve stories about trade with a city whose location had become unclear, whose very existence might come to be questioned by later generations who'd never encountered anyone who'd actually been there. Geographic knowledge became local and practical. The paths to neighboring villages, the location of water sources, the boundaries of territory actually controlled rather than extending to create mental maps of the broader region. Ruins remained present across the landscape, massive stone structures whose purpose had become mysterious. Mycenaean fortification walls built from stones so large that later Greeks called them Cyclopean and attributed them to giants, unable to imagine how human labor could have moved such masses. Palace complexes whose elaborate plans reflected administrative functions that no longer existed. These ruins were impressive and inexplicable in roughly equal measure. Around these remnants of the past, stories formed to make sense of what couldn't be understood through direct experience. Some explanations attributed construction to ancestors who had been greater, stronger, more capable than current generations. Others invoked spirits or gods or other supernatural forces. These accounts didn't aim for historical accuracy in any modern sense. They offered continuity, linking present communities to a past that could no longer be directly known, but which remained physically present in the landscape. The development of such stories is a normal human response to unexplained artifacts from the past. Without written records to consult, without continuous memory linking present to past, people create narratives that make sense within their current worldview. The stories served important functions, even when they bore little relationship to historical reality. They helped communities understand their landscape, established connections to place, provided identities rooted in particular territories and traditions. Myth replaced record without conflict because written records were no longer available to conflict with. The stories became the authoritative account of the past, simply by being the only account available. Later, Greeks inherited these mythological traditions and treated them as history, not realizing how much had been transformed through centuries of oral transmission. The Trojan War, the voyages of heroes, the great kingdoms and their mighty rulers. All of these contained some kernel of memory from the Bronze Age, but wrapped in so many layers of later addition and modification that separating history from invention became essentially impossible. Time passed without the kind of documentation that allows precise chronology. We can't construct detailed year-by-year histories of most regions during the 12th through 10th centuries BC because the sources simply don't exist. Archaeological layers can be dated within ranges of decades or generations, but rarely more precisely. This makes it difficult to trace exactly how changes unfolded, whether certain developments were rapid or gradual, what the causal relationships between events in different regions might have been. This documentary silence shouldn't be mistaken for absence of historical change. things were certainly happening during these centuries. Populations shifted. New settlements appeared while others were abandoned. Technologies evolved. Ironworking improved. Pottery styles changed. Building techniques adapted. Political organization took new forms. All of this happened, but mostly without leaving the kinds of detailed traces that written records provide. What we can see archaeologically is that the period from roughly 1150 to 900 BC represents a low point in many measures of social complexity across the affected regions. Settlement numbers declined significantly in most areas. Sites that do exist are generally smaller than Bronze Age settlements. Monumental architecture virtually disappears. Evidence of long-distance trade becomes minimal. Pottery is simpler and more locally produced. Burial practices suggest less social differentiation than in the Bronze Age. But these archaeological observations measure certain kinds of activity that happen to leave durable traces. They don't directly measure quality of life or human meaning or cultural richness. A society that builds smaller buildings from less durable materials, that creates simpler pottery, that doesn't engage in long-distance trade, such a society leaves less for archaeologists to find. But it's not necessarily a society where people lived worse lives in all respects. The oral traditions that flourished during this period, the stories and songs that were eventually written down when literacy returned, represent genuine cultural achievements. The process of creating and transmitting oral tradition requires different skills than literacy, but no less sophisticated ones. The bards who could perform lengthy epics from memory, who could adjust traditional stories for different audiences and occasions while maintaining their essential structure, were practicing a demanding art that commanded respect in their societies. These oral traditions would eventually become foundational texts when they were written down. The Homeric epics, composed orally probably in the 8th century BC, but drawing on traditions stretching back through the Dark Age into the Bronze Age, became central to Greek cultural identity. The stories preserved in what would become biblical texts, composed and compiled over many centuries, shaped entire civilizations. The fact that these traditions originated and evolved during a period without writing doesn't diminish their significance. It demonstrates the capacity of oral culture to maintain and transmit complex narratives across generations. Skills endured where they remained useful for subsistence and local life. Farming methods refined to local conditions continued to be practiced and improved through experimentation and observation. The knowledge of when to plant, how to manage water, which techniques worked for which crops, all of this persisted because it had immediate practical value. Craft traditions adapted to available materials and local needs. Pottery making, weaving, basic metalworking, construction techniques. These continued because communities needed their products. But specialization declined significantly. In the Bronze Age, you could devote your entire working life to being a scribe or a specialized metalworker because palace systems would support you in exchange for your specific skills. Without those institutional supports, most people needed to be more generalists. A farmer might also make pottery for household use, do basic construction work, produce simple textiles. The efficiency that comes from specialization was largely lost, but adaptability increased. Knowledge became more practical and regional, less theoretical or standardized across distances. There were no longer scribal schools teaching standardized forms of record-keeping. There were no palace workshops maintaining consistent production standards for goods destined for regional trade. Instead, knowledge was localized, how things were done here, in this community, using these materials for these purposes. This localization meant that practices diverged across regions much more than they had during the Bronze Age, when palace administrations had maintained some degree of standardization. There was no sense of waiting for recovery during this period, no expectation that the Bronze Age world would return. For people living in the 11th or 10th century BC, especially those born more than a generation after the collapse, The Bronze Age was ancient history, if it was remembered at all. This was their normal, the world as they'd always known it. Life unfolded within accepted limits, shaped by immediate environment and community relationships, rather than by institutional structures or long-distance connections. The quiet that characterized this period from our perspective, the absence of written records, the reduced material culture, the simpler social organization, was experienced by contemporaries as normalcy rather than as silence or darkness. Their lives had sound and meaning and activity, just organized differently than Bronze Age life had been. Fields were worked, which produced the rhythmic sounds of agricultural labor. Communities gathered for festivals and celebrations, which produced music and voices and movement. Children played and learned and grew, experiencing their world as complete, even though it was smaller in scale than what had existed generations earlier. This period left few traces by design. Oral traditions don't fossilize in the ground waiting for archaeologists. Wooden buildings decay completely, leaving only post holes, if even that. Simple pottery is common, but hard to date precisely, and tells us less about social organization than elaborate Bronze Age administrative archives did. The apparent emptiness in our historical record reflects what was being done and made, not necessarily how people experienced their lives. The long quiet from our historical perspective was not a pause or an interruption. It was a different kind of time, measured by different markers, remembered through different means. Generations lived their full lives, experienced joy and sorrow, created families and communities, developed cultures and traditions, all without leaving the documentary trace that would allow historians to write detailed accounts of their experiences. What this period demonstrates, perhaps, is human resilience and adaptability. When the complex Bronze Age systems collapsed, people didn't simply cease to function. They adapted. They found new ways to organize society at scales that were sustainable without writing, without long-distance trade, without palace administration. They maintained communities and meaning within reduced horizons. And slowly, unevenly, over centuries, they began to rebuild complexity in new forms. The world that had been bound by bronze dissolved into smaller worlds, each functioning on its own terms, each creating meaning for its inhabitants, each contributing in ways we can only partially trace to the eventual recovery and renewal that would create the civilizations of classical antiquity. The quiet was real, but it was full of life nonetheless. Chept, C. Losing. A world that once worked. Looking back across the long span of what has been described here, from the mature Bronze Age world of the 14th century BC, through the collapse around 1200 BC and into the centuries of recovery that followed, certain patterns become visible that weren't apparent to anyone living through those times. We can see, with the clarity that only historical distance provides, how a system that worked reliably for generations could break down when conditions changed in ways that overwhelmed its adaptive capacity. The Bronze Age world was not a failed experiment, or a society doomed from its inception. For centuries, it was simply how life was organized across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. It represented accumulated human ingenuity, the product of generations of people solving practical problems and building on solutions that worked. The long-distance trade networks that brought copper and tin together to create bronze, the palace systems that coordinated production and redistribution, the diplomatic relationships that managed regional politics, the writing systems that made complex administration possible, all of these were genuine achievements. These systems made sense within the conditions that created them. They relied on materials that could be accessed and exchanged. They depended on routes that remained navigable and reasonably secure. They drew authority from institutions capable of storing resources, redistributing goods, and maintaining order. None of these assumptions were unreasonable, given the historical experience available to Bronze Age peoples. They were grounded in centuries of practice that had proven these methods effective. The accomplishments were real and substantial. Bronze Age societies sustained larger populations than had been possible earlier. They built impressive architecture that still dominates landscapes today. They created art and literature that influenced subsequent cultures even after the Bronze Age itself ended. They developed administrative techniques that allowed coordination across hundreds of kilometers. They maintained trade networks that spanned the known world. These weren't minor achievements. They represented major advances in human capacity to organize collectively. When conditions began to shift, whether through climate change affecting agriculture, political instabilities disrupting exchange, population movements creating pressure, or most likely some combination of multiple factors, the response was initially adaptive rather than paralyzed. Palace administrations attempted to manage shortages through redistribution. Trade networks sought alternative routes when primary ones became unreliable. Communities fortified defensively when threats appeared. These were reasonable responses based on successful past practice. What made this time different was not any single catastrophic event, but the accumulation and interaction of multiple stresses faster than solutions could be implemented. The system that had proven resilient during previous challenges faced conditions for which its resilience proved insufficient. This wasn't because the system was inherently fragile. It had demonstrated durability across generations. It was because the specific combination of problems that arose around 1200 BC exceeded what that particular system could absorb while maintaining functionality. The collapse that followed was not universal or uniform. Different regions experienced disruption at different times and in different ways. Some areas maintained more continuity than others. The ending of the Bronze Age world looked different in Egypt than in Greece, different in Cyprus than in Anatolia. This variation actually reinforces that we're not dealing with a single external cause, but with systemic breakdown, where local circumstances determined specific outcomes. What ended was not human life or human culture, but a particular way of organizing both across distance and time. The palace-centered administrative systems disappeared. The long-distance trade networks that had brought materials from distant sources ceased functioning in their Bronze Age form. The specialized literacy that had enabled complex administration was lost in most regions. These endings were real and represented genuine loss of capabilities that had existed. But people continued. This is perhaps the most important thing to remember. The collapse of systems, however impressive those systems had been, didn't mean the collapse of human communities or human meaning. People still farmed land that would grow food. Craftspeople still practiced skills learned over years of training. Communities still gathered for celebrations and rituals that maintained connection to tradition and to each other. Parents still raised children, passing on knowledge and values. Life continued within altered circumstances. The centuries that followed the collapse were different from what had come before, but they weren't empty or meaningless. They represented adaptation to new realities, finding ways to sustain life and community without the institutional structures that had characterized the Bronze Age. This adaptation was itself an achievement, demonstrating human capacity to continue functioning when familiar patterns break down, to find new ways of organizing when old ones become impossible. What eventually emerged from this period of adaptation was genuinely new, rather than simply a restoration of what had been lost. The civilizations of the first millennium BC, classical Greece, Phoenician trading networks, Assyrian and Persian empires, resurgent Egypt, all organized society according to principles quite different from Bronze Age models. They achieved impressive scales of coordination, but through different mechanisms. The alphabet replaced complex syllabic writing systems, making literacy more accessible. Market-based exchange became more important relative to palace redistribution. Political organization took new forms adapted to new circumstances. The Bronze Age world that ended around 1200 BC was never rebuilt because it couldn't be rebuilt. The specific conditions that had sustained it no longer existed. But the human capacity to build, to organize, to create complex societies didn't disappear with the Bronze Age. It manifested in new forms, adapted to new conditions, eventually creating societies that would themselves shape subsequent history profoundly. What remains now, for us looking back across more than 3,000 years, is evidence embedded in the ground and preserved in texts. The ruins of palaces that once coordinated regional economies, the shipwrecks containing cargoes that document ancient trade, the tablets pressed with administrative records of daily business, the layers of ash marking destruction, the pottery styles that changed as networks broke down, the settlement patterns that show population decline and eventual recovery. From these fragments, we reconstruct a world that once worked. We can't recreate the daily experience of living in that world. We lack too much detail, too much context, but we can understand the outline, the shape of systems that bound societies together, the mechanisms that enabled coordination, the dependencies that created both capability and vulnerability. We can trace how success built over generations could break down when circumstances changed in ways that exceeded adaptive capacity. There's no simple lesson to extract from this history, no warning that applies straightforwardly to other times and places. The specifics matter too much. The Bronze Age collapse resulted from a particular combination of factors affecting societies organized in particular ways. Different societies facing different challenges won't necessarily follow similar patterns. History doesn't repeat that mechanically. But perhaps there's value in recognizing that societies that seem solid and permanent, that have worked reliably for generations, that appear to be simply the natural order of things, such societies are actually contingent. They function because specific conditions align to allow their functioning. When those conditions change significantly, adaptation becomes necessary. Sometimes adaptation succeeds, and societies adjust to new circumstances. Sometimes it doesn't, and systems that seemed permanent prove unable to sustain themselves under altered conditions. The Bronze Age world was not destined to collapse. Under different circumstances, different climate patterns, different political developments, different timing of various stresses, it might have continued or evolved differently. That it did collapse tells us something about the specific vulnerabilities of highly connected, tightly coordinated systems when multiple disruptions occur simultaneously. But it doesn't tell us that collapse is inevitable or that complexity is inherently unstable. What it does suggest is that success and stability, however long they've endured, don't guarantee permanence. The systems that work today work because current conditions allow them to work. If conditions change significantly, adaptation becomes necessary. The Bronze Age world couldn't adapt quickly enough or extensively enough to survive the particular challenges it faced around 1200 BC. That failure doesn't make it a cautionary tale. It makes it a historical episode worth understanding on its own terms. And so we return to where we began, to a world bound together by bronze, by ships crossing familiar seas, by palaces coordinating production across distance, by scribes recording the daily business of administration. That world functioned for centuries before it ended. During its existence, it represented human achievement, the capacity to organize collectively, to sustain complexity, to create systems that served real human needs. Its ending came not because it was flawed in conception, but because conditions changed in ways that exceeded its resilience. The people living through that ending couldn't see the full pattern of what was happening. They experienced it as a series of problems to solve, disruptions to manage, adaptations to make. Only in retrospect, with evidence from across regions and over decades, does the systemic nature of the breakdown become apparent. After the fall, life continued in new forms. The long quiet that settled over the landscape was not silence, but transformation. Smaller communities, more local organization, different ways of maintaining knowledge and tradition. All of these represented adaptation rather than ending. Human life persisted, carrying forward what could be carried, letting go of what couldn't be sustained, creating new patterns suited to new circumstances. The memory of the Bronze Age world faded, but never disappeared entirely. It lived on in distorted form through oral tradition, in the ruins that dominated landscapes, in the occasional preserved practices that connected later peoples to their distant past, without them fully understanding that connection. When writing returned and literacy spread again centuries later, some of these memories were eventually recorded, becoming the myths and legends that would shape later cultures. And now, thousands of years after the Bronze Age ended, we excavate its ruins, decipher its tablets, analyze its remains, and attempt to reconstruct what that world was like. We can't fully succeed. Too much is lost. Too much is ambiguous. But we can understand enough to recognize that this was a real world, inhabited by real people, organized according to real patterns that made sense to those living within them. The Bronze Age world worked, until it didn't. Its story isn't a warning or a lesson, so much as it is simply what happened. A chapter in human history that began, developed, flourished, and ended, making way for whatever would come next. In remembering it, we acknowledge that the ways humans have organized society are diverse and historically contingent, that what works under one set of conditions may not work under others, and that change, even profound disruptive change, is part of the human experience. As we finish this journey through the Bronze Age world, the last image might be of an abandoned palace at sunset, its stones catching the failing light, its corridors silent where once they echoed with footsteps and voices. Nearby, a farmer returns from fields that once fed palace storerooms, but now simply feed his family. The child walking beside him knows nothing of what those ruins once meant. For him, they're simply part of the landscape, interesting perhaps, but not meaningful in any historical sense. That child will live his life, raise his own children, pass on what he knows to be true and useful. His world is smaller than his great-grandparents' world was, but it's his world, complete and meaningful on its own terms. The Bronze Age has ended, but the human story continues, generation after generation, adapting to whatever circumstances exist, finding ways to live with meaning within those circumstances. The world bound by bronze is gone, but its passing, like its existence, was part of the long human journey through time, one chapter ending so that others might begin. That's all, and that's enough.